This audiobook is based on Leo Tolstoy's collection, 23 Stories, translated by Lewis and Aylmer Maude, and published in 1907. The collection consists of 23 short stories each. The Maudes were renowned translators of Tolstoy's works and had a personal relationship with the author, making their translations particularly noteworthy. Their work helped introduce Tolstoy's short stories to English-speaking readers. So why not start with the first story? Part 1, Tales for Children. First story, God sees the truth but waits. In the town of Vladimir lived a young merchant named Ivan Dmitritch Aksionov. He had 2 shops and a house of his own. Aksionov was a handsome, fair-haired, curly-headed fellow, full of fun and very fond of singing. When quite a young man, he had been given to drink and was riotous when he had had too much, but after he married he gave up drinking, except now and then. One summer, Aksionov was going to the Nizhny Fair, and as he bade goodbye to his family, his wife said to him, "Ivan Dmitritch, do not start today. I've had a bad dream about you." Aksionov laughed and said, "You are afraid that when I get to the fair I shall go on the spree." His wife replied, "I do not know what I'm afraid of. All I know is that I had a bad dream. I dreamt you returned from the town, and when you took off your cap I saw that your hair was quite grey." Aksionov laughed. "That's a lucky sign," said he. "See if I don't sell out all my goods and bring you some presents from the fair." So he said goodbye to his family and drove away. When he had travelled halfway, he met a merchant whom he knew, and they put up at the same inn for the night. They had some tea together, and then went to bed in adjoining rooms. It was not Aksionov's habit to sleep late, and wishing to travel while it was still cool, he aroused his driver before dawn and told him to put in the horses. Then he made his way across to the landlord of the inn, who lived in a cottage at the back, paid his bill, and continued his journey. When he had gone about 25 miles, he stopped for the horses to be fed. Aksionov rested a while in the passage of the inn. Then he stepped out into the porch and, ordering a samovar to be heated, got out his guitar and began to play. Suddenly a troika drove up with tinkling bells, and an official alighted, followed by 2 soldiers. He came to Aksionov and began to question him, asking him who he was and whence he came. Aksionov answered him fully and said, "Won't you have some tea with me?" But the official went on cross-questioning him and asking him, "Where did you spend last night? Were you alone or with a fellow merchant? Did you see the other merchant this morning? Why did you leave the inn before dawn?" Aksionov wondered why he was asked all these questions, but he described all that had happened and then added, "Why do you cross-question me as if I were a thief or a robber? I am travelling on business of my own, and there is no need to question me." Then the official, calling the soldiers, said, "I am the police officer of this district, and I question you because the merchant with whom you spent last night has been found with his throat cut. We must search your things." They entered the house. The soldiers and the police officer unstrapped Aksionov's luggage and searched it. Suddenly, the officer drew a knife out of a bag, crying, "Whose knife is this?" Aksionov looked, and seeing a blood-stained knife taken from his bag, he was frightened. "How is it there is blood on this knife?" Aksionov tried to answer, but could hardly utter a word, and only stammered, I don't know, not mine." Then the police officer said, "This morning the merchant was found in bed with his throat cut. You are the only person who could have done it. The house was locked from inside, and no one else was there. Here is this blood-stained knife in your bag, and your face and manner betray you. Tell me how you killed him and how much money you stole." Aksionov swore he had not done it, that he had not seen the merchant after they had had tea together, that he had no money except 8,000 rubles of his own, and that the knife was not his. But his voice was broken, his face pale, and he trembled with fear as though he were guilty. The police officer ordered the soldiers to bind Aksionov and to put him in the cart. As they tied his feet together and flung him into the cart, Aksionov crossed himself and wept. His money and goods were taken from him, and he was sent to the nearest town and imprisoned there. Inquiries as to his character were made in Vladimir. The merchants and other inhabitants of that town said that in former days he used to drink and waste his time, but that he was a good man. Then the trial came on. He was charged with murdering a merchant from Ryazan and robbing him of 20,000 rubles. His wife was in despair and did not know what to believe. Her children were all quite small. One was a baby at her breast. Taking them all with her, she went to the town where her husband was in jail. At first, she was not allowed to see him, but after much begging, she obtained permission from the officials and was taken to him. When she saw her husband in prison dress and in chains, shut up with thieves and criminals, she fell down and did not come to her senses for a long time. Then she drew her children to her and sat down near him. She told him of things at home and asked about what had happened to him. He told her all, and she asked, "What can we do now?" "We must petition the Tsar not to let an innocent man perish." His wife told him that she had sent a petition to the Tsar, but that it had not been accepted. Aksionov did not reply, but only looked downcast. Then his wife said, "It was not for nothing. I dreamt your hair had turned grey. You remember? You should not have started that day." And passing her fingers through his hair, she said, "Vanya, dearest, tell your wife the truth. Was it not you who did it?" "So you too suspect me," said Aksionov, and hiding his face in his hands, he began to weep. Then a soldier came to say that the wife and children must go away, and Aksionov said goodbye to his family for the last time. When they were gone, Aksionov recalled what had been said, and when he remembered that his wife also had suspected him, he said to himself, "It seems that only God can know the truth. It is to him alone we must appeal, and from him alone expect mercy." And Aksionov wrote no more petitions, gave up all hope, and only prayed to God. Aksionov was condemned to be flogged and sent to the mines. So he was flogged with a knout, and when the wounds made by the knout were healed, he was driven to Siberia with other convicts. For 26 years, Aksionov lived as a convict in Siberia. His hair turned white as snow, and his beard grew long, thin and grey. All his mirth went. He stooped. He walked slowly, spoke little and never laughed, but he often prayed. In prison, Aksionov learnt to make boots and earned a little money with which he bought the lives of the saints. He read this book when there was light enough in the prison, and on Sundays in the prison church he read the lessons and sang in the choir, for his voice was still good. The prison authorities liked Aksionov for his meekness, and his fellow prisoners respected him. They called him Grandfather and the Saint. When they wanted to petition the prison authorities about anything, they always made Aksionov their spokesman, and when there were quarrels among the prisoners, they came to him to put things right and to judge the matter. No news reached Aksionov from his home, and he did not even know if his wife and children were still alive. One day, a fresh gang of convicts came to the prison. In the evening, the old prisoners collected round the new ones and asked them what towns or villages they came from and what they were sentenced for. Among the rest, Aksionov sat down near the newcomers and listened with downcast air to what was said. One of the new convicts, a tall, strong man of 60 with a closely cropped grey beard, was telling the others what he had been arrested for. "Well, friends," he said, "I only took a horse that was tied to a sledge, and I was arrested and accused of stealing. I said I had only taken it to get home quicker and had then let it go. Besides, the driver was a personal friend of mine, so I said, 'It's all right.' 'No,' said they, 'you stole it.' But how or where I stole it they could not say. I once really did something wrong and ought by rights to have come here long ago, but that time I was not found out. Now I have been sent here for nothing at all. Hey, but it's lies I'm telling you. I've been to Siberia before, but I did not stay long." "Where are you from?" asked someone. "From Vladimir. My family are of that town. My name is Makar, and they also call me Semyonich." Aksionov raised his head and said, "Tell me, Semyonich, do you know anything of the merchants Aksionov of Vladimir? Are they still alive?" "Know them? Of course I do. The Aksionovs are rich, though their father is in Siberia, a sinner like ourselves, it seems. As for you, Grandad, how did you come here?" Aksionov did not like to speak of his misfortune. He only sighed and said, "For my sins I have been in prison these 26 years. "What sins?" asked Makar Semyonich. But Aksionov only said, Well, I must have deserved it." He would have said no more, but his companions told the newcomer how Aksionov came to be in Siberia, how someone had killed a merchant and had put a knife among Aksionov's things, and Aksionov had been unjustly condemned. When Makar Semyonich heard this, he looked at Aksionov, slapped his own knee and exclaimed, "Well, this is wonderful, really wonderful. But how old you've grown, Grandad." The others asked him why he was so surprised and where he had seen Aksionov before, but Makar Semyonich did not reply. He only said, "It's wonderful that we should meet here, lads." These words made Aksionov wonder whether this man knew who had killed the merchant. So he said, "Perhaps, Semyonich, you have heard of that affair, or maybe you've seen me before?" "How could I help hearing? The world's full of rumors, but it's long ago and I've forgotten what I heard." "Perhaps you heard who killed the merchant?" asked Aksionov. Makar Semyonich laughed and replied, "It must have been him in whose bag the knife was found. If someone else hid the knife there, he's not a thief till he's caught, as the saying is. How could anyone put a knife into your bag while it was under your head? It would surely have woke you up." When Aksionov heard these words, he felt sure this was the man who had killed the merchant. He rose and went away. All that night, Aksionov lay awake. He felt terribly unhappy, and all sorts of images rose in his mind. There was the image of his wife as she was when he parted from her to go to the fair. He saw her as if she were present. Her face and her eyes rose before him. He heard her speak and laugh. Then he saw his children, quite little as they were at that time, one with a little cloak on, another at his mother's breast. And then he remembered himself as he used to be, young and merry. He remembered how he sat playing the guitar in the porch of the inn where he was arrested, and how free from care he had been. He saw in his mind the place where he was flogged, the executioner and the people standing around, the chains, the convicts, all the 26 years of his prison life, and his premature old age. The thought of it all made him so wretched that he was ready to kill himself. "And it's all that villain's doing," thought Aksionov. And his anger was so great against Makar Semyonich that he longed for vengeance, even if he himself should perish for it. He kept repeating prayers all night, but could get no peace. During the day he did not go near Makar Semyonich, nor even look at him. A fortnight passed in this way. Aksionov could not sleep at nights, and was so miserable that he did not know what to do. One night, as he was walking about the prison, he noticed some earth that came rolling out from under one of the shelves on which the prisoners slept. He stopped to see what it was. Suddenly, Makar Semyonich crept out from under the shelf and looked up at Aksionov with frightened face. Aksionov tried to pass without looking at him, but Makar seized his hand and told him that he had dug a hole under the wall, getting rid of the earth, by putting it into his high boots and emptying it out every day on the road when the prisoners were driven to their work. "Just you keep quiet, old man, and you shall get out too. If you blab, they'll flog the life out of me, but I will kill you first." Aksionov trembled with anger as he looked at his enemy. He drew his hand away, saying, "I have no wish to escape, and you have no need to kill me. You killed me long ago. As to telling of you, I may do so or not, as God shall direct." Next day, when the convicts were led out to work, the convoy soldiers noticed that one or other of the prisoners emptied some earth out of his boots. The prison was searched and the tunnel found. The governor came and questioned all the prisoners to find out who had dug the hole. They all denied any knowledge of it. Those who knew would not betray Makar Semyonich, knowing he would be flogged almost to death. At last, The governor turned to Aksionov, whom he knew to be a just man, and said, "You are a truthful old man. Tell me before God who dug the hole." Makar Semyonich stood as if he were quite unconcerned, looking at the governor and not so much as glancing at Aksionov. Aksionov's lips and hands trembled, and for a long time he could not utter a word. He thought, "Why should I screen him who ruined my life? Let him pay for what I have suffered. But if I tell, they will probably flog the life out of him, and maybe I suspect him wrongly. And after all, what good would it be to me?" "Well, old man," repeated the governor, "tell us the truth. Who has been digging under the wall?" Aksionov glanced at Makar Semyonich and said, "I cannot say, Your Honor. It is not God's will that I should tell. Do what you like with me. I am in your hands." However much the governor tried, Aksionov would say no more, and so the matter had to be left. That night, when Aksionov was lying on his bed and just beginning to doze, someone came quietly and sat down on his bed. He peered through the darkness and recognized Makar. "What more do you want of me?" asked Aksionov. "Why have you come here?" Makar Semyonich was silent. So Aksionov sat up and said, "What do you want? Go away, or I will call the guard." Makar Semyonich bent close over Aksionov and whispered, "Ivan Dmitrich, forgive me." "What for?" asked Aksionov. "It was I who killed the merchant and hid the knife among your things. I meant to kill you too, but I heard a noise outside, so I hid the knife in your bag and escaped out of the window." Aksionov was silent and did not know what to say. Makar Semyonich slid off the bed-shelf and knelt upon the ground. "Ivan Dmitrich," said he, "forgive me. For the love of God, forgive me. I will confess that it was I who killed the merchant, and you will be released and can go to your home." "It is easy for you to talk," said Aksionov, "but I have suffered for you these 26 years. Where could I go to now? My wife is dead, and my children have forgotten me. I have nowhere to go." Makar Semyonich did not rise, but beat his head on the floor. "Ivan Dmitrich, forgive me," he cried. "When they flogged me with the knout, it was not so hard to bear as it is to see you now. Yet you had pity on me and did not tell. For Christ's sake, forgive me, wretch that I am." And he began to sob. When Aksionov heard him sobbing, he too began to weep. "God will forgive you," said he. "Maybe I am 100 times worse than you." And at these words, his heart grew light, and the longing for home left him. He no longer had any desire to leave the prison, but only hoped for his last hour to come. In spite of what Aksionov had said, Makar Semyonich confessed his guilt. But when the order for his release came, Aksionov was already dead.
Second story, a prisoner in the Caucasus. An officer named Zhilin was serving in the army in the Caucasus. One day he received a letter from home. It was from his mother, who wrote, "I am getting old, and should like to see my dear son once more before I die. Come and say goodbye to me and bury me, and then, if God pleases, return to service again with my blessing. But I have found a girl for you, who is sensible and good and has some property. If you can love her, you might marry her and remain at home." Zhilin thought it over. It was quite true. The old lady was failing fast, and he might not have another chance to see her alive. He had better go, and if the girl was nice, why not marry her? So he went to his colonel, obtained leave of absence, said goodbye to his comrades, stood the soldiers 4 pailfuls of vodka as a farewell treat, and got ready to go. It was a time of war in the Caucasus. The roads were not safe by night or day. If ever a Russian ventured to ride or walk any distance away from his fort, the Tartars killed him or carried him off to the hills. So it had been arranged that twice every week, a body of soldiers should march from one fortress to the next to convoy travelers from point to point. It was summer. At daybreak, the baggage train got ready under shelter of the fortress. The soldiers marched out, and all started along the road. Jilin was on horseback, and a cart with his things went with the baggage train. They had 16 miles to go. The baggage train moved slowly. Sometimes the soldiers stopped, or perhaps a wheel would come off one of the carts, or a horse refused to go on, and then everybody had to wait. When by the sun it was already past noon, they had not gone half the way. It was dusty and hot. The sun was scorching, and there was no shelter anywhere. A bare plain all round, not a tree, not a bush, by the road. Jilin rode on in front and stopped, waiting for the baggage to overtake him. Then he heard the signal horn sounded behind him. The company had again stopped. So he began to think, hadn't I better ride on by myself? My horse is a good one. If the Tartars do attack me, I can gallop away. Perhaps, however, it would be wiser to wait. As he sat considering, Kostilin, an officer carrying a gun, rode up to him and said, "Come along, Jilin. Let's go on by ourselves. It's dreadful. I am famished, and the heat is terrible. My shirt is wringing wet." Kostilin was a stout, heavy man, and the perspiration was running down his red face. Jilin thought a while, and then asked, "Is your gun loaded?" "Yes, it is." "Well then, let's go, but on condition that we keep together." So they rode forward along the road across the plain, talking but keeping a lookout on both sides. They could see afar all round. But after crossing the plain, the road ran through a valley between two hills, and Jilin said, "We had better climb that hill and have a look round, or the Tartars may be on us before we know it." But Kostilin answered, "What's the use? Let us go on." Jilin, however, would not agree. "No," he said, "you can wait here if you like, but I'll go and look round." And he turned his horse to the left, up the hill. Jilin's horse was a hunter, and carried him up the hillside as if it had wings. He had bought it for 100 rubles as a colt out of a herd, and had broken it in himself. Hardly had he reached the top of the hill, when he saw some 30 Tartars not much more than 100 yards ahead of him. As soon as he caught sight of them, he turned round, but the Tartars had also seen him, and rushed after him at full gallop, getting their guns out as they went. Down galloped Jilin as fast as the horse's legs could go, shouting to Kostilin, "Get your gun ready!" And in thought he said to his horse, "Get me well out of this, my pet. Don't stumble, for if you do, it's all up. Once I reach the gun, they shan't take me prisoner." But instead of waiting, Kostilin, as soon as he caught sight of the Tartars, turned back towards the fortress at full speed, whipping his horse now on one side, now on the other, and its switching tail was all that could be seen of him in the dust. Jilin saw it was a bad lookout. The gun was gone, and what could he do with nothing but his sword? He turned his horse towards the escort, thinking to escape, but there were 6 Tartars rushing to cut him off. His horse was a good one, but theirs were still better, and besides, they were across his path. He tried to rein in his horse and to turn another way, but it was going so fast it could not stop, and dashed on straight towards the Tartars. He saw a red-bearded Tartar on a grey horse with his gun raised, come at him, yelling and showing his teeth. "Ah," thought Jilin, "I know you devils that you are. If you take me alive, you'll put me in a pit and flog me. I will not be taken alive." Jilin, though not a big fellow, was brave. He drew his sword and dashed at the red-bearded Tartar, thinking, "Either I'll ride him down or disable him with my sword." He was still a horse's length away from him when he was fired at from behind, and his horse was hit. It fell to the ground with all its weight, pinning Jilin to the earth. He tried to rise, but 2 ill-savoured Tartars were already sitting on him and binding his hands behind his back. He made an effort and flung them off, but 3 others jumped from their horses and began beating his head with the butts of their guns. His eyes grew dim, and he fell back. The Tartars seized him, and taking spare girths from their saddles, twisted his hands behind him and tied them with a Tartar knot. They knocked his cap off, pulled off his boots, searched him all over, tore his clothes, and took his money and his watch. Jilin looked round at his horse. There it lay on its side, poor thing, just as it had fallen, struggling, its legs in the air, unable to touch the ground. There was a hole in its head, and black blood was pouring out, turning the dust to mud for a couple of feet around. One of the Tartars went up to the horse and began taking the saddle off. It still kicked, so he drew a dagger and cut its windpipe. A whistling sound came from its throat. The horse gave one plunge, and all was over. The Tartars took the saddle and trappings. The red-bearded Tartar mounted his horse, and the others lifted Jilin into the saddle behind him. To prevent his falling off, they strapped him to the Tartar's girdle, and then they all rode away to the hills. So there sat Jilin, swaying from side to side, his head striking against the Tartar's stinking back. He could see nothing but that muscular back and sinewy neck, with its closely shaven bluish nape. Jilin's head was wounded. The blood had dried over his eyes, and he could neither shift his position on the saddle nor wipe the blood off. His arms were bound so tightly that his collarbones ached. They rode up and down hills for a long way. Then they reached a river which they forded and came to a hard road leading across a valley. Jilin tried to see where they were going, but his eyelids were stuck together with blood, and he could not turn. Twilight began to fall. They crossed another river and rode up a stony hillside. There was a smell of smoke here, and dogs were barking. They had reached an aoul, a Tartar village. The Tartars got off their horses. Tartar children came and stood round Jilin, shrieking with pleasure and throwing stones at him. The Tartar drove the children away, took Jilin off the horse, and called his man, a Nogai with high cheekbones and nothing on but a shirt, and that so torn that his breast was all bare, answered the call. The Tartar gave him an order. He went and fetched shackles, 2 blocks of oak with iron rings attached, and a clasp and lock fixed to one of the rings. They untied Jilin's arms, fastened the shackles on his leg, and dragged him to a barn, where they pushed him in and locked the door. Jilin fell on a heap of manure. He lay still a while, then groped about to find a soft place, and settled down. That night Jilin hardly slept at all. It was the time of year when the nights are short, and daylight soon showed itself through a chink in the wall. He rose, scratched to make the chink bigger, and peeped out. Through the hole he saw a road leading downhill. To the right was a Tartar hut with 2 trees near it. A black dog lay on the threshold, and a goat and kids were moving about wagging their tails. Then he saw a young Tartar woman in a long, loose, bright-colored gown with trousers and high boots showing from under it. She had a coat thrown over her head, on which she carried a large metal jug filled with water. She was leading by the hand a small, closely shaven Tartar boy, who wore nothing but a shirt, and as she went along balancing herself, the muscles of her back quivered. This woman carried the water into the hut, and soon after, the red-bearded Tartar of yesterday came out dressed in a silk tunic, with a silver-hilted dagger hanging by his side, shoes on his bare feet, and a tall black sheepskin cap set far back on his head. He came out, stretched himself and stroked his red beard. He stood a while, gave an order to his servant, and went away. Then 2 lads rode past from watering their horses. The horses' noses were wet. Some other closely shaven boys ran out, without any trousers and wearing nothing but their shirts. They crowded together, came to the barn, picked up a twig, and began pushing it in at the chink. Jilin gave a shout, and the boys shrieked and scampered off, their little bare knees gleaming as they ran. Jilin was very thirsty. His throat was parched, and he thought, if only they would come and so much as look at me. Then he heard someone unlocking the barn. The red-bearded Tartar entered, and with him was another, a smaller man, dark with bright black eyes, red cheeks, and a short beard. He had a merry face and was always laughing. This man was even more richly dressed than the other. He wore a blue silk tunic trimmed with gold, a large silver dagger in his belt, red Morocco slippers worked with silver, and over these a pair of thick shoes, and he had a white sheepskin cap on his head. The red-bearded Tartar entered, muttered something as if he were annoyed, and stood leaning against the doorpost, playing with his dagger, and glaring askance at Jilin, like a wolf, the dark one, quick and lively, and moving as if on springs, came straight up to Jilin, squatted down in front of him, slapped him on the shoulder, and began to talk very fast in his own language. His teeth showed, and he kept winking, clicking his tongue, and repeating, "Good Ross, good Ross." Jilin could not understand a word, but said, "Drink, give me water to drink." The dark man only laughed. "Good Ross," he said, and went on talking in his own tongue. Jilin made signs with lips and hands that he wanted something to drink. The dark man understood, and laughed. Then he looked out of the door and called to someone. "Dina!" A little girl came running in. She was about 13, slight, thin, and like the dark Tartar in face. Evidently she was his daughter. She too had clear black eyes, and her face was good-looking. She had on a long blue gown, with wide sleeves and no girdle. The hem of her gown, the front, and the sleeves were trimmed with red. She wore trousers and slippers, and over the slippers stouter shoes with high heels. Round her neck she had a necklace made of Russian silver coins. She was bareheaded, and her black hair was plaited with a ribbon and ornamented with gilt braid and silver coins. Her father gave an order, and she ran away and returned with a metal jug. She handed the water to Jilin and sat down, crouching so that her knees were as high as her head, and there she sat with wide-open eyes, watching Jilin drink, as though he were a wild animal. When Jilin handed the empty jug back to her, she gave such a sudden jump back, like a wild goat, that it made her father laugh. He sent her away for something else. She took the jug, ran out, and brought back some unleavened bread on a round board, and once more sat down, crouching and looking on with staring eaves. Then the Tartars went away, and again locked the door. After a while the Nogai came and said, "Ada, the master, Ada." He too knew no Russian. All Jilin could make out was that he was told to go somewhere. Jilin followed the Nogai, but limped, for the shackles dragged his feet so that he could hardly step at all. On getting out of the barn, he saw a Tartar village of about 10 houses, and a Tartar church with a small tower. 3 horses stood saddled before one of the houses. Little boys were holding them by the reins. The dark Tartar came out of this house, beckoning with his hand for Jilin to follow him. Then he laughed, said something in his own language, and returned into the house. Jilin entered. The room was a good one, the walls smoothly plastered with clay. Near the front wall lay a pile of bright-colored feather beds. The side walls were covered with rich carpets used as hangings, and on these were fastened guns, pistols, and swords, all inlaid with silver. Close to one of the walls was a small stove on a level with the earthen floor. The floor itself was as clean as a thrashing ground. A large space in one corner was spread over with felt, on which were rugs, and on these rugs were cushions stuffed with down. And on these cushions sat 5 Tartars, the dark one, the red-haired one, and 3 guests. They were wearing their indoor slippers, and each had a cushion behind his back. Before them were standing millet cakes on a round board, melted butter in a bowl, and a jug of boozer, or Tartar beer. They ate both cakes and butter with their hands. The dark man jumped up and ordered Jillin to be placed on one side, not on the carpet but on the bare ground. Then he sat down on the carpet again and offered millet cakes and boozer to his guests. The servant made Jillin sit down, after which he took off his own overshoes, put them by the door where the other shoes were standing, and sat down nearer to his masters on the felt, watching them as they ate and licking his lips. The Tartars ate as much as they wanted, and a woman dressed in the same way as the girl, in a long gown and trousers, with a kerchief on her head, came and took away what was left and brought a handsome basin and an ewer with a narrow spout. The Tartars washed their hands, folded them, went down on their knees, blew to the 4 quarters, and said their prayers. After they had talked for a while, one of the guests turned to Jillin and began to speak in Russian. "You were captured by Qazi Mohammed," he said, and pointed at the red-bearded Tartar. "And Qazi Mohammed has given you to Abdul Murat," pointing at the dark one. "Abdul Murat is now your master." Jillin was silent. Then Abdul Murat began to talk, laughing, pointing to Jillin, and repeating, "Soldier Russ, good Russ." The interpreter said, "He orders you to write home and tell them to send a ransom, and as soon as the money comes, he will set you free." Jillin thought for a moment and said, "How much ransom does he want?" The Tartars talked a while, and then the interpreter said, 3,000 rubles. "No," said Jillin. "I can't pay so much." Abdul jumped up and, waving his arms, talked to Jillin, thinking, as before, that he would understand. The interpreter translated, "How much will you give?" Jillin considered and said, 500 rubles. At this, the Tartars began speaking very quickly, all together. Abdul began to shout at the red-bearded one, and jabbered so fast that the spittle spurted out of his mouth. The red-bearded one only screwed up his eyes and clicked his tongue. They quietened down after a while, and the interpreter said, 500 rubles is not enough for the master. He paid 200 for you himself. Qazi Mohammed was in debt to him, and he took you in payment, 3,000 rubles. Less than that won't do. If you refuse to write, you will be put into a pit and flogged with a whip." Thought Jillin. The more one fears them, the worse it will be. So he sprang to his feet and said, "You tell that dog that if he tries to frighten me, I will not write at all, and he will get nothing. I never was afraid of you dogs, and never will be." The interpreter translated, and again they all began to talk at once. They jabbered for a long time, and then the dark man jumped up, came to Jillin and said, "Jigit Russ! Jigit Russ!" Tajigit in their language means brave. And he laughed and said something to the interpreter, who translated, 1,000 rubles will satisfy him. Jillin stuck to it. "I will not give more than 500, and if you kill me, you'll get nothing at all." The Tartars talked a while, then sent the servant out to fetch something, and kept looking, now at Jillin, now at the door. The servant returned, followed by a stout, barefooted, tattered man, who also had his leg shackled. Jillin gasped with surprise. It was Kostilin. He too had been taken. They were put side by side and began to tell each other what had occurred. While they talked, the Tartars looked on in silence. Jillin related what had happened to him, and Kostilin told how his horse had stopped, his gun missed fire, and this same Abdul had overtaken and captured him. Abdul jumped up, pointed to Kostilin, and said something. The interpreter translated that they both now belonged to one master, and the one who first paid the ransom would be set free first. "There now," he said to Jillin. "You get angry, But your comrade here is gentle. He has written home, and they will send 5,000 rubles. So he will be well fed and well treated." Jilin replied, "My comrade can do as he likes. Maybe he is rich. I am not. It must be as I said. Kill me, if you like. You will gain nothing by it, but I will not write for more than 500 rubles." They were silent. Suddenly up sprang Abdul, brought a little box, took out a pen, ink, and a bit of paper, gave them to Zilin, slapped him on the shoulder, and made a sign that he should write. He had agreed to take 500 rubles. "Wait a bit," said Zilin to the interpreter. "Tell him that he must feed us properly, give us proper clothes and boots, and let us be together. It will be more cheerful for us, and he must have these shackles taken off our feet." And Zilin looked at his master and laughed. The master also laughed, heard the interpreter, and said, "I will give them the best of clothes, a cloak and boots fit to be married in. I will feed them like princes, and if they like they can live together in the barn. But I can't take off the shackles, or they will run away. They shall be taken off, however, at night." And he jumped up and slapped Jilin on the shoulder, exclaiming, "You good, I good." Jilin wrote the letter, but addressed it wrongly, so that it should not reach its destination, thinking to himself, "I'll run away." Jilin and Kostilin were taken back to the barn and given some maize straw, a jug of water, some bread, 2 old cloaks, and some worn-out military boots, evidently taken from the corpses of Russian soldiers. At night their shackles were taken off their feet, and they were locked up in the barn. Jilin and his friend lived in this way for a whole month. The master always laughed and said, "You, Ivan, good. I, Abdul, good." But he fed them badly, giving them nothing but unleavened bread of millet flour, baked into flat cakes, or sometimes only unbaked dough. Kostilin wrote home a second time, and did nothing but mope and wait for the money to arrive. He would sit for days together in the barn sleeping, or counting the days till a letter could come. Jilin knew his letter would reach no one, and he did not write another. He thought, "Where could my mother get enough money to ransom me? As it is, she lived chiefly on what I sent her. If she had to raise 500 rubles, she would be quite ruined. With God's help, I'll manage to escape." So he kept on the lookout, planning how to run away. He would walk about the aul whistling, or would sit working, modeling dolls of clay, or weaving baskets out of twigs. For Jilin was clever with his hands. Once he modeled a doll with a nose and hands and feet, and with a Tartar gown on, and put it up on the roof. When the Tartar women came out to fetch water, the master's daughter, Dina, saw the doll and called the women, who put down their jugs and stood looking and laughing. Jilin took down the doll and held it out to them. They laughed, but dared not take it. He put down the doll and went into the barn, waiting to see what would happen. Dina ran up to the doll, looked round, seized it, and ran away. In the morning at daybreak, he looked out. Dina came out of the house and sat down on the threshold with the doll, which she had dressed up in bits of red stuff, and she rocked it like a baby, singing a Tartar lullaby. An old woman came out and scolded her, and snatching the doll away, she broke it to bits and sent Dina about her business. But Jilin made another doll, better than the first, and gave it to Dina. Once Dina brought a little jug, put it on the ground, sat down gazing at him and laughed, pointing to the jug. What pleases her so? Wondered Jilin. He took the jug thinking it was water, but it turned out to be milk. He drank the milk and said, "That's good." How pleased Dina was. "Good, Ivan, good," said she, and she jumped up and clapped her hands. Then seizing the jug, she ran away. After that, she stealthily brought him some milk every day. The Tartars make a kind of cheese out of goat's milk, which they dry on the roofs of their houses, and sometimes, on the sly, she brought him some of this cheese. And once, when Abdul had killed a sheep, she brought Jilin a bit of mutton in her sleeve. She would just throw the things down and run away. One day there was a heavy storm, and the rain fell in torrents for a whole hour. All the streams became turbid. At the ford, the water rose till it was 7 feet high, and the current was so strong that it rolled the stones about. Rivulets flowed everywhere, and the rumbling in the hills never ceased. When the storm was over, the water ran in streams down the village street. Jilin got his master to lend him a knife, and with it he shaped a small cylinder, and cutting some little boards, he made a wheel to which he fixed 2 dolls, one on each side. The little girls brought him some bits of stuff, and he dressed the dolls, one as a peasant, the other as a peasant woman. Then he fastened them in their places and set the wheel so that the stream should work it. The wheel began to turn, and the dolls danced. The whole village collected round. Little boys and girls, Tartar men and women, all came and clicked their tongues. Ah, Russ! Ah, Ivan! Abdul had a Russian clock, which was broken. He called Jilin and showed it to him, clicking his tongue. "Give it me. I'll mend it for you," said Jilin. He took it to pieces with the knife, sorted the pieces, and put them together again, so that the clock went all right. The master was delighted and made him a present of one of his old tunics, which was all in holes. Jilin had to accept it. He could at any rate use it as a coverlet at night. After that, Jilin's fame spread, and Tartars came from distant villages, bringing him now the lock of a gun or of a pistol, now a watch, to mend. His master gave him some tools, pincers, gimlets, and a file. One day a Tartar fell ill, and they came to Jilin saying, "Come and heal him." Jilin knew nothing about doctoring, but he went to look and thought to himself, "Perhaps he will get well anyway." He returned to the barn, mixed some water with sand, and then, in the presence of the Tartars, whispered some words over it and gave it to the sick man to drink. Luckily for him, the Tartar recovered. Jilin began to pick up their language a little, and some of the Tartars grew familiar with him. When they wanted him, they would call, "Ivan, Ivan." Others, however, still looked at him askance, as at a wild beast. The red-bearded Tartar disliked Jilin. Whenever he saw him, he frowned and turned away, or swore at him. There was also an old man there who did not live in the aoul, but used to come up from the foot of the hill. Jilin only saw him when he passed on his way to the mosque. He was short and had a white cloth wound round his hat. His beard and moustaches were clipped and white as snow, and his face was wrinkled and brick red. His nose was hooked like a hawk's. His gray eyes looked cruel, and he had no teeth except 2 tusks. He would pass, with his turban on his head, leaning on his staff, and glaring round him like a wolf. If he saw Jilin, he would snort with anger and turn away. Once Jilin descended the hill to see where the old man lived. He went down along the pathway and came to a little garden, surrounded by a stone wall. And behind the wall, he saw cherry and apricot trees, and a hut with a flat roof. He came closer, and saw hives made of plaited straw, and bees flying about and humming. The old man was kneeling, busy doing something with a hive. Jilin stretched to look, and his shackles rattled. The old man turned round and, giving a yell, snatched a pistol from his belt and shot at Jilin, who just managed to shelter himself behind the stone wall. The old man went to Jilin's master to complain. The master called Jilin and said with a laugh, "Why did you go to the old man's house?" "I did him no harm," replied Jilin. "I only wanted to see how he lived." The master repeated what Jilin said, but the old man was in a rage. He hissed and jabbered, showing his tusks and shaking his fists at Jilin. Jilin could not understand all, but he gathered that the old man was telling Abdul he ought not to keep Russians in the aoul, but ought to kill them. At last the old man went away. Jilin asked the master who the old man was. "He is a great man," said the master. "He was the bravest of our fellows. He killed many Russians and was at one time very rich. He had 3 wives and 8 sons, and they all lived in one village. Then the Russians came and destroyed the village and killed 7 of his sons. Only 1 son was left, and he gave himself up to the Russians. The old man also went and gave himself up, and lived among the Russians for 3 months. At the end of that time he found his son, killed him with his own hands, and then escaped. After that he left off fighting, and went to Mecca to pray to God. That is why he wears a turban. One who has been to Mecca is called Haji, and wears a turban. He does not like you, fellows. He tells me to kill you. But I can't kill you. I have paid money for you, and besides, I have grown fond of you. Ivan, far from killing you, I would not even let you go if I had not promised." And he laughed, saying in Russian, "You, Ivan, good. I, Abdul, good." Jilin lived in this way for a month. During the day he sauntered about the aoul or busied himself with some handicraft. But at night, when all was silent in the aoul, he dug at the floor of the barn. It was no easy task digging because of the stones, but he worked away at them with his file, and at last had made a hole under the wall large enough to get through. "If only I could get to know the lay of the land," thought he, "and which way to go, but none of the Tartars will tell me." So he chose a day when the master was away from home, and set off after dinner to climb the hill beyond the village and to look around. But before leaving home, the master always gave orders to his son to watch Jilin, and not to lose sight of him. So the lad ran after Jilin, shouting, "Don't go! Father does not allow it. I'll call the neighbors if you won't come back." Jilin tried to persuade him and said, "I'm not going far. I only want to climb that hill. I want to find a herb to cure sick people with. You come with me if you like. How can I run away with these shackles on? Tomorrow I'll make a bow and arrows for you." So he persuaded the lad, and they went. To look at the hill, it did not seem far to the top, but it was hard walking with shackles on his leg. Jilin went on and on, but it was all he could do to reach the top. There he sat down and noted how the land lay. To the south, beyond the barn, was a valley in which a herd of horses was pasturing, and at the bottom of the valley one could see another aoul. Beyond that was a still steeper hill, and another hill beyond that. Between the hills, in the blue distance, were forests, and still further off were mountains, rising higher and higher. The highest of them were covered with snow, white as sugar, and one snowy peak towered above all the rest. To the east and to the west were other such hills, and here and there smoke rose from aouls in the ravines. "Ah," thought he, "all that is Tartar country." And he turned towards the Russian side. At his feet he saw a river, and the aoul he lived in, surrounded by little gardens. He could see women, like tiny dolls, sitting by the river rinsing clothes. Beyond the aoul was a hill, lower than the one to the south, and beyond it 2 other hills well wooded, and between these a smooth bluish plain, and far, far across the plain something that looked like a cloud of smoke. Jilin tried to remember where the sun used to rise and set when he was living in the fort, and he saw that there was no mistake. The Russian fort must be in that plain. Between those 2 hills he would have to make his way when he escaped. The sun was beginning to set. The white snowy mountains turned red, and the dark hills turned darker. Mists rose from the ravine, and the valley, where he supposed the Russian fort to be, seemed on fire with the sunset glow. Jilin looked carefully. Something seemed to be quivering in the valley like smoke from a chimney, and he felt sure the Russian fortress was there. It had grown late. The mullah's cry was heard. The herds were being driven home, the cows were lowing, and the lad kept saying, "Come home!" But Jilin did not feel inclined to go away. At last, however, they went back. "Well," thought Jilin, "now that I know the way, it is time to escape." He thought of running away that night. The nights were dark, the moon had waned. But as ill luck would have it, the Tartars returned home that evening. They generally came back driving cattle before them, and in good spirits. But this time, they had no cattle. All they brought home was the dead body of a Tartar, the Red One's brother, who had been killed. They came back looking sullen, and they all gathered together for the burial. Jilin also came out to see it. They wrapped the body in a piece of linen without any coffin, and carried it out of the village and laid it on the grass under some plane trees. The mullah and the old men came. They wound clothes round their caps, took off their shoes, and squatted on their heels, side by side, near the corpse. The mullah was in front. Behind him in a row were 3 old men in turbans, and behind them again, the other Tartars. All cast down their eyes and sat in silence. This continued a long time, until the mullah raised his head and said, "Allah," which means God. He said that one word, and they all cast down their eyes again, and were again silent for a long time. They sat quite still, not moving or making any sound. Again the mullah lifted his head and said, "Allah," and they all repeated, "Allah, Allah," and were again silent. The dead body lay immovable on the grass, and they sat as still as if they too were dead. Not one of them moved. There was no sound but that of the leaves of the plane trees stirring in the breeze. Then the mullah repeated a prayer, and they all rose. They lifted the body and carried it in their arms to a hole in the ground. It was not an ordinary hole, but was hollowed out under the ground like a vault. They took the body under the arms and by the legs, bent it, and let it gently down, pushing it under the earth in a sitting posture with the hands folded in front. The Nogai brought some green rushes, which they stuffed into the hole, and quickly covering it with earth, they smoothed the ground and set an upright stone at the head of the grave. Then they trod the earth down and again sat in a row before the grave, keeping silence for a long time. At last they rose, said, "Allah, Allah, Allah," and sighed. The red-bearded Tartar gave money to the old men. Then he too rose, took a whip, struck himself with it 3 times on the forehead, and went home. The next morning Jilin saw the red Tartar, followed by 3 others, leading a mare out of the village. When they were beyond the village, the red-bearded Tartar took off his tunic and turned up his sleeves, showing his stout arms. Then he drew a dagger and sharpened it on a whetstone. The other Tartars raised the mare's head, and he cut her throat, threw her down, and began skinning her, loosening the hide with his big hands. Women and girls came and began to wash the entrails and the inwards. The mare was cut up, the pieces taken into the hut, and the whole village collected at the Red Tartar's hut for a funeral feast. For 3 days they went on eating the flesh of the mare, drinking booza, and praying for the dead man. All the Tartars were at home. On the 4th day at dinner time, Jilin saw them preparing to go away. Horses were brought out, they got ready, and some 10 of them, the Red One among them, rode away. But Abdul stayed at home. It was new moon, and the nights were still dark. "Ah," thought Jilin, "tonight is the time to escape." And he told Kostilin, but Kostilin's heart failed him. "How can we escape?" he said. "We don't even know the way." "I know the way," said Jilin. "Even if you do," said Kostilin, "we can't reach the fort in one night." "If we can't," said Jilin, "we'll sleep in the forest. See here, I have saved some cheeses. What's the good of sitting and moping here? If they send your ransom, well and good. But suppose they don't manage to collect it. The Tatars are angry now, because the Russians have killed one of their men. They are talking of killing us." Kostilin thought it over. "Well, let's go," said he. Jilin crept into the hole, widened it so that Kostilin might also get through, and then they both sat waiting till all should be quiet in the aul. As soon as all was quiet, Jilin crept under the wall, got out, and whispered to Kostilin, "Come." Kostilin crept out, but in so doing he caught a stone with his foot and made a noise. The master had a very vicious watchdog, a spotted one called Ulyashin. Jilin had been careful to feed him for some time before. Ulyashin heard the noise and began to bark and jump, and the other dogs did the same. Jilin gave a slight whistle and threw him a bit of cheese. Ulyashin knew Jilin, wagged his tail, and stopped barking. But the master had heard the dog and shouted to him from his hut, "Hide, hide, Ulyashin." Jilin, however, scratched Ulyashin behind the ears, and the dog was quiet and rubbed against his legs, wagging his tail. They sat hidden behind a corner for a while. All became silent again. Only a sheep coughed inside a shed, and the water rippled over the stones in the hollow. It was dark. The stars were high overhead, and the new moon showed red as it set, horns upward, behind the hill. In the valleys the fog was white as milk. Jilin rose and said to his companion, "Well, friend, come along." They started, but they had only gone a few steps when they heard the mullah crying from the roof, "Allah Beshmillah, Il-Rahman." That meant that the people would be going to the mosque, so they sat down again, hiding behind a wall, and waited a long time till the people had passed. At last all was quiet again. "Now then, may God be with us." They crossed themselves and started once more. They passed through a yard and went down the hillside to the river, crossed the river and went along the valley. The mist was thick, but only near the ground. Overhead the stars shone quite brightly. Jilin directed their course by the stars. It was cool in the mist and easy walking, only their boots were uncomfortable, being worn out and trodden down. Jilin took his off, threw them away, and went barefoot, jumping from stone to stone and guiding his course by the stars. Kostilin began to lag behind. "Walk slower," he said. "These confounded boots have quite blistered my feet." "Take them off," said Jilin. "It will be easier walking without them." Kostilin went barefoot, but got on still worse. The stones cut his feet, and he kept lagging behind. Jilin said, "If your feet get cut, they'll heal again. But if the Tatars catch us and kill us, it will be worse." Kostilin did not reply, but went on, groaning all the time. Their way lay through the valley for a long time. Then to the right, they heard dogs barking. Jilin stopped, looked about, and began climbing the hill, feeling with his hands. "Ah," said he, "we have gone wrong, and have come too far to the right. Here is another aul, one I saw from the hill. We must turn back and go up that hill to the left. There must be a wood there." But Kostilin said, "Wait a minute, let me get breath. My feet are all cut and bleeding." "Never mind, friend, they'll heal again. You should spring more lightly. Like this." And Jilin ran back and turned to the left up the hill towards the wood. Kostilin still lagged behind and groaned. Jilin only said, "Hush," and went on and on. They went up the hill and found a wood, as Jilin had said. They entered the wood and forced their way through the brambles, which tore their clothes. At last they came to a path and followed it. Stop! They heard the tramp of hoofs on the path and waited, listening. It sounded like the tramping of a horse's feet, but then ceased. They moved on, and again they heard the tramping. When they paused, it also stopped. Jilin crept nearer to it and saw something standing on the path where it was not quite so dark. It looked like a horse and yet not quite like one, and on it was something queer, not like a man. He heard it snorting. What can it be? Jilin gave a low whistle, and off it dashed from the path into the thicket, and the woods were filled with the noise of crackling, as if a hurricane were sweeping through, breaking the branches. Kostilin was so frightened that he sank to the ground, but Jilin laughed and said, "It's a stag. Don't you hear him breaking the branches with his antlers? We were afraid of him, and he is afraid of us." They went on. The great bear was already setting. It was near morning, and they did not know whether they were going the right way or not. Jilin thought it was the way he had been brought by the Tartars, and that they were still some 7 miles from the Russian fort. But he had nothing certain to go by, and at night one easily mistakes the way. After a time they came to a clearing. Kostilin sat down and said, "Do as you like, I can go no farther. My feet won't carry me." Jilin tried to persuade him. "No, I shall never get there. I can't." Jilin grew angry and spoke roughly to him. "Well then, I shall go on alone. Goodbye." Kostilin jumped up and followed. They went another 3 miles. The mist in the wood had settled down still more densely. They could not see a yard before them, and the stars had grown dim. Suddenly they heard the sound of a horse's hooves in front of them. They heard its shoes strike the stones. Jilin lay down flat and listened with his ear to the ground. "Yes, so it is. A horseman is coming towards us." They ran off the path, crouched among the bushes and waited. Jilin crept to the road, looked, and saw a Tartar on horseback, driving a cow and humming to himself. The Tartar rode past. Jilin returned to Kostilin. "God has led him past us. Get up and let's go on." Kostilin tried to rise but fell back again. "I can't. On my word, I can't. I have no strength left." He was heavy and stout, and had been perspiring freely. Chilled by the mist, and with his feet all bleeding, he had grown quite limp. Jilin tried to lift him, when suddenly Kostilin screamed out, "Oh, how it hurts!" Jilin's heart sank. "What are you shouting for? The Tartar is still near. He'll have heard you." And he thought to himself, "He is really quite done up. What am I to do with him? It won't do to desert a comrade." "Well then, get up and climb up on my back. I'll carry you if you really can't walk." He helped Kostilin up and put his arms under his thighs. Then he went out onto the path, carrying him. "Only for the love of heaven," said Jilin, "don't throttle me with your hands. Hold on to my shoulders." Jilin found his load heavy. His feet too were bleeding, and he was tired out. Now and then he stooped to balance Kostilin better, jerking him up so that he should sit higher, and then went on again. The Tartar must, however, really have heard Kostilin scream. Jilin suddenly heard someone galloping behind and shouting in the Tartar tongue. He darted in among the bushes. The Tartar seized his gun and fired, but did not hit them, shouted in his own language, and galloped off along the road. "Well, now we are lost, friend," said Jilin. "That dog will gather the Tartars together to hunt us down. Unless we can get a couple of miles away from here, we are lost." And he thought to himself, "Why the devil did I saddle myself with this block? I should have got away long ago had I been alone." "Go on alone," said Kostilin. "Why should you perish because of me?" "No, I won't go. It won't do to desert a comrade." Again he took Kostilin on his shoulders and staggered on. They went on in that way for another half-mile or more. They were still in the forest and could not see the end of it, but the mist was already dispersing and clouds seemed to be gathering. The stars were no longer to be seen. Jilin was quite done up. They came to a spring walled in with stones by the side of the path. Jilin stopped and set Kostilin down. "Let me have a rest and a drink," said he, "and let us eat some of the cheese. It can't be much farther now." But hardly had he lain down to get a drink when he heard the sound of horses' feet behind him. Again they darted to the right among the bushes and lay down under a steep slope. They heard Tartar voices. The Tartars stopped at the very spot where they had turned off the path. The Tartars talked a bit, and then seemed to be setting a dog on the scent. There was a sound of crackling twigs, and a strange dog appeared from behind the bushes. It stopped and began to bark. Then the Tartars, also strangers, came climbing down, seized Jilin and Kostilin, bound them, put them on horses, and rode away with them. When they had ridden about the 2 miles, they met Abdul, their owner, with 2 other Tartars following him. After talking with the strangers, he put Jilin and Kostilin on 2 of his own horses and took them back to the aoul. Abdul did not laugh now and did not say a word to them. They were back at the aoul by daybreak and were set down in the street. The children came crowding round, throwing stones, shrieking, and beating them with whips. The Tartars gathered together in a circle, and the old man from the foot of the hill was also there. They began discussing, and Jilin heard them considering what should be done with him and Kostilin. Some said they ought to be sent farther into the mountains, but the old man said, "They must be killed." Abdul disputed with him, saying, "I gave money for them, and I must get ransom for them." But the old man said, "They will pay you nothing, but will only bring misfortune. It is a sin to feed Russians. Kill them, and have done with it." They dispersed. When they had gone, the master came up to Jilin and said, "If the money for your ransom is not sent within a fortnight, I will flog you, and if you try to run away again, I'll kill you like a dog. Write a letter, and write properly." Paper was brought to them, and they wrote the letters. Shackles were put on their feet, and they were taken behind the mosque to a deep pit about 12 feet square, into which they were let down. Life was now very hard for them. Their shackles were never taken off, and they were not let out into the fresh air. Unbaked dough was thrown to them as if they were dogs, and water was let down in a can. It was wet and close in the pit, and there was a horrible stench. Kostilin grew quite ill. His body became swollen, and he ached all over, and moaned or slept all the time. Jilin too grew downcast. He saw it was a bad lookout and could think of no way of escape. He tried to make a tunnel, but there was nowhere to put the earth. His master noticed it and threatened to kill him. He was sitting on the floor of the pit one day, thinking of freedom and feeling very downhearted, when suddenly a cake fell into his lap, then another, and then a shower of cherries. He looked up, and there was Dina. She looked at him, laughed, and ran away, and Jilin thought, "Might not Dina help me?" He cleared out a little place in the pit, scraped up some clay, and began modeling toys. He made men, horses, and dogs, thinking, "When Dina comes, I'll throw them up to her." But Dina did not come next day. Jilin heard the tramp of horses. Some men rode past, and the Tartars gathered in council near the mosque. They shouted and argued. The word Russians was repeated several times. He could hear the voice of the old man. Though he could not distinguish what was said, he guessed that Russian troops were somewhere near, and that the Tartars, afraid they might come into the aoul, did not know what to do with their prisoners. After talking a while, they went away. Suddenly, he heard a rustling overhead and saw Dina crouching at the edge of the pit, her knees higher than her head, and bending over so that the coins of her plait dangled above the pit. Her eyes gleamed like stars. She drew 2 cheeses out of her sleeve and threw them to him. Jilin took them and said, "Why did you not come before? I have made some toys for you. Here, catch." And he began throwing the toys up one by one, but she shook her head and would not look at them. "I don't want any," she said. She sat silent for a while and then went on. "Ivan, they want to kill you." And she pointed to her own throat. "Who wants to kill me?" "Father, the old men say he must, but I am sorry for you." Jilin answered, "Well, if you are sorry for me, bring me a long pole." She shook her head as much as to say, "I can't." He clasped his hands and prayed her, "Dinah, please do. Dear Dina, I beg of you." "I can't," she said. "They would see me bringing it. They're all at home." And she went away. So when evening came, Jilin still sat looking up now and then, and wondering what would happen. The stars were there, but the moon had not yet risen. The mullah's voice was heard. Then all was silent. Jilin was beginning to doze, thinking, "The girl will be afraid to do it." Suddenly he felt clay falling on his head. He looked up and saw a long pole poking into the opposite wall of the pit. It kept poking about for a time, and then it came down, sliding into the pit. Jilin was glad indeed. He took hold of it and lowered it. It was a strong pole, one that he had seen before on the roof of his master's hut. He looked up. The stars were shining high in the sky, and just above the pit, Dina's eyes gleamed in the dark like a cat's. She stooped with her face close to the edge of the pit and whispered, "Ivan, Ivan," waving her hand in front of her face to show that he should speak low. "What?" said Jilin. "All but 2 have gone away." Then Jilin said, "Well, Kostilin, come. Let us have one last try. I'll help you up." But Kostilin would not hear of it. "No," said he. "It's clear I can't get away from here. How can I go when I have hardly strength to turn round?" "Well, goodbye then. Don't think ill of me." And they kissed each other. Jilin seized the pole, told Dina to hold on, and began to climb. He slipped once or twice. The shackles hindered him. Kostilin helped him, and he managed to get to the top. Dina, with her little hands, pulled with all her might at his shirt, laughing. Jilin drew out the pole and said, "Put it back in its place, Dina, or they'll notice, and you will be beaten." She dragged the pole away, and Jilin went down the hill. When he had gone down the steep incline, he took a sharp stone and tried to wrench the lock off the shackles. But it was a strong lock, and he could not manage to break it. And besides, it was difficult to get at. Then he heard someone running down the hill, springing lightly. He thought, "Surely that's Dina again." Dina came, took a stone, and said, "Let me try." She knelt down and tried to wrench the lock off, but her little hands were as slender as little twigs, and she had not the strength. She threw the stone away and began to cry. Then Jilin set to work again at the lock, and Dina squatted beside him with her hand on his shoulder. Jilin looked round and saw a red light to the left behind the hill. The moon was just rising. "Ah," he thought, "before the moon has risen, I must have passed the valley and be in the forest." So he rose and threw away the stone. Shackles or no, he must go on. "Goodbye, Dinah dear," he said. "I shall never forget you." Dina seized hold of him and felt about with her hands for a place to put some cheeses she had brought. He took them from her. "Thank you, my little one. Who will make dolls for you when I am gone?" And he stroked her head. Dina burst into tears, hiding her face in her hands. Then she ran up the hill like a young goat, the coins in her plait clinking against her back. Jilin crossed himself, took the lock of his shackles in his hand to prevent its clattering, and went along the road, dragging his shackled leg and looking towards the place where the moon was about to rise. He now knew the way. If he went straight, he would have to walk nearly 6 miles. If only he could reach the wood before the moon had quite risen. He crossed the river. The light behind the hill was growing whiter. Still looking at it, he went along the valley. The moon was not yet visible. The light became brighter, and one side of the valley was growing lighter and lighter, and shadows were drawing in towards the foot of the hill, creeping nearer and nearer to him. Jilin went on, keeping in the shade. He was hurrying, but the moon was moving still faster. The tops of the hills on the right were already lit up. As he got near the wood, the white moon appeared from behind the hills, and it became light as day. One could see all the leaves on the trees. It was light on the hill, but silent, as if nothing were alive. No sound could be heard, but the gurgling of the river below. Jilin reached the wood without meeting anyone, chose a dark spot, and sat down to rest. He rested and ate one of the cheeses. Then he found a stone and set to work again to knock off the shackles. He knocked his hands sore, but could not break the lock. He rose and went along the road. After walking the greater part of a mile, he was quite done up, and his feet were aching. He had to stop up every 10 steps. "There's nothing else for it," thought he. "I must drag on as long as I have any strength left. If I sit down, I shan't be able to rise again. I can't reach the fortress, but when day breaks, I'll lie down in the forest, remain there all day, and go on again at night." He went on all night. 2 Tartars on horseback passed him, but he heard them a long way off and hid behind a tree. The moon began to grow paler, the dew to fall. It was getting near dawn, and Jilin had not reached the end of the forest. "Well," thought he, "I'll walk another 30 steps, and then turn in among the trees and sit down." He walked another 30 steps, and saw that he was at the end of the forest. He went to the edge. It was now quite light, and straight before him was the plain and the fortress. To the left, quite close at the foot of the slope, a fire was dying out, and the smoke from it spread round. There were men gathered about the fire. He looked intently and saw guns glistening. They were soldiers, Cossacks. Jilin was filled with joy. He collected his remaining strength and set off down the hill, saying to himself, "God forbid that any mounted Tartar should see me now, in the open field. Near as I am, I could not get there in time." Hardly had he said this when, a couple of 100 yards off, on a hillock to the left, he saw 3 Tartars. They saw him also, and made a rush. His heart sank. He waved his hands and shouted with all his might, "Brothers! Brothers! Help!" The Cossacks heard him, and a party of them on horseback darted to cut across the Tartars' path. The Cossacks were far, and the Tartars were near. But Jilin too made a last effort. Lifting the shackles with his hand, he ran towards the Cossacks, hardly knowing what he was doing, crossing himself and shouting, "Brothers! Brothers! Brothers!" There were some 15 Cossacks. The Tartars were frightened and stopped before reaching him. Jilin staggered up to the Cossacks. They surrounded him and began questioning him. "Who are you? What are you? Where from?" But Jilin was quite beside himself and could only weep and repeat, "Brothers! Brothers!" Then the soldiers came running up and crowded round Jilin, one giving him bread, another buckwheat, a third vodka, one wrapping a cloak round him, another breaking his shackles. The officers recognized him and rode with him to the fortress. The soldiers were glad to see him back, and his comrades, all gathered round him, Jilin told them all that had happened to him. "That's the way I went home and got married," said he. "No, it seems plain that fate was against it." So he went on serving in the Caucasus. A month passed before Kostilin was released, after paying 5,000 rubles ransom. He was almost dead when they brought him back.
Third story, The Bear Hunt. The adventure here narrated is one that happened to Tolstoy himself in 1858. More than 20 years later, he gave up hunting on humanitarian grounds. We were out on a bear hunting expedition. My comrade had shot at a bear, but only gave him a flesh wound. There were traces of blood on the snow, but the bear had got away. We all collected in a group in the forest to decide whether we ought to go after the bear at once, or wait 2 or 3 days till he should settle down again. We asked the peasant bear drivers whether it would be possible to get round the bear that day. "No, it's impossible," said an old bear driver. "You must let the bear quiet down. In 5 days' time, it will be possible to surround him. But if you followed him now, you would only frighten him away and he would not settle down." But a young bear driver began disputing with the old man, saying that it was quite possible to get round the bear now. "On such snow as this," said he won't go far, for he is a fat bear. He will settle down before evening. Or if not, I can overtake him on snowshoes." The comrade I was with was against following up the bear and advised waiting. But I said, "We need not argue. You do as you like, but I will follow up the track with Damien. If we get round the bear, all right. If not, we lose nothing. It is still early, and there is nothing else for us to do today." So it was arranged. The others went back to the sledges and returned to the village. Damien and I took some bread and remained behind in the forest. When they had all left us, Damien and I examined our guns, and after tucking the skirts of our warm coats into our belts, we started off, following the bear's tracks. The weather was fine, frosty and calm, but it was hard work snowshoeing. The snow was deep and soft. It had not caked together at all in the forest, and fresh snow had fallen the day before, so that our snowshoes sank 6 inches deep in the snow and sometimes more. The bear's tracks were visible from a distance, and we could see how he had been going, sometimes sinking in up to his belly and ploughing up the snow as he went. At first, while under large trees, we kept in sight of his track. But when it turned into a thicket of small firs, Damien stopped. "We must leave the trail now," said he. "He has probably settled somewhere here. You can see by the snow that he has been squatting down. Let us leave the track and go round, but we must go quietly. Don't shout or cough, or we shall frighten him away." Leaving the track, therefore, we turned off to the left. But when we had gone about 500 yards, there were the bear's traces again right before us. We followed them, and they brought us out onto the road. There we stopped, examining the road to see which way the bear had gone. Here and there in the snow were prints of the bear's paw, claws and all, and here and there the marks of a peasant's bark shoes. The bear had evidently gone towards the village. As we followed the road, Damien said, "It's no use watching the road now. We shall see where he has turned off, to right or left, by the marks in the soft snow at the side. He must have turned off somewhere, for he won't have gone on to the village." We went along the road for nearly a mile, and then saw ahead of us the bear's track turning off the road. We examined it. How strange! It was a bear's track right enough, only not going from the road into the forest, but from the forest on to the road. The toes were pointing towards the road. "This must be another bear," I said. Damien looked at it and considered a while. "No," said he, "it's the same one. He's been playing tricks and walked backwards when he left the road." We followed the track and found it really was so. The bear had gone some 10 steps backwards and then, behind a fir tree, had turned round and gone straight ahead. Damien stopped and said, "Now we are sure to get round him. There is a marsh ahead of us, and he must have settled down there. Let us go round it." We began to make our way round, through a fir thicket. I was tired out by this time, and it had become still more difficult to get along. Now I glided onto juniper bushes and caught my snowshoes in them. Now a tiny fir tree appeared between my feet, or, from want of practice, my snowshoes slipped off, and now I came upon a stump or a log hidden by the snow. I was getting very tired and was drenched with perspiration, and I took off my fur cloak. And there was Damien all the time, gliding along as if in a boat, his snowshoes moving as if of their own accord, never catching against anything, nor slipping off. He even took my fur and slung it over his shoulder, and still kept urging me on. We went on for 2 more miles, and came out on the other side of the marsh. I was lagging behind. My snowshoes kept slipping off, and my feet stumbled. Suddenly Damien, who was ahead of me, stopped and waved his arm. When I came up to him, he bent down, pointing with his hand, and whispered, "Do you see the magpie chattering above that undergrowth? It sensed the bear from afar. That is where he must be." We turned off and went on for more than another half-mile, and presently we came on to the old track again. We had therefore been right round the bear, who was now within the track we had left. We stopped, and I took off my cap and loosened all my clothes. I was as hot as in a steam bath, and as wet as a drowned rat. Damien, too, was flushed and wiped his face with his sleeve. "Well, sir," he said, "we have done our job, and now we must have a rest." The evening glow already showed red through the forest. We took off our snowshoes and sat down on them, and got some bread and salt out of our bags. First I ate some snow and then some bread, and the bread tasted so good that I thought I had never in my life had any like it before. We sat there resting until it began to grow dusk, and then I asked Damien if it was far to the village. "Yes," he said, "it must be about 8 miles. We will go on there tonight, but now we must rest. Put on your fur coat, sir, or you'll be catching cold." Damien flattened down the snow, and breaking off some fir branches made a bed of them. We lay down side by side, resting our heads on our arms. I do not remember how I fell asleep. 2 hours later I woke up hearing something crack. I had slept so soundly that I did not know where I was. I looked around me. How wonderful! I was in some sort of a hall, all glittering and white with gleaming pillars. And when I looked up I saw, through delicate white tracery, a vault, raven black and studded with coloured lights. After a good look, I remembered that we were in the forest, and that what I took for a hall and pillars were trees covered with snow and hoarfrost, and the coloured lights were stars twinkling between the branches. Hoarfrost had settled in the night. All the twigs were thick with it. Damien was covered with it. It was on my fur coat, and it dropped down from the trees. I woke Damien, and we put on our snowshoes and started. It was very quiet in the forest. No sound was heard but that of our snowshoes pushing through the soft snow, except when now and then a tree, cracked by the frost, made the forest resound. Only once we heard the sound of a living creature. Something rustled close to us, and then rushed away. I felt sure it was the bear. But when we went to the spot whence the sound had come, we found the footmarks of hares and saw several young aspen trees with their bark gnawed. We had startled some hares while they were feeding. We came out on the road and followed it, dragging our snowshoes behind us. It was easy walking now. Our snowshoes clattered as they slid behind us from side to side of the hard-trodden road. The snow creaked under our boots, and the cold hoarfrost settled on our faces like down. Seen through the branches, the stars seemed to be running to meet us, now twinkling, now vanishing, as if the whole sky were on the move. I found my comrade sleeping, but woke him up, and related how we had got round the bear. After telling our peasant host to collect beeters for the morning, we had supper and lay down to sleep. I was so tired that I could have slept on till midday if my comrade had not roused me. I jumped up and saw that he was already dressed and busy doing something to his gun. "Where is Damien?" said I. "In the forest, long ago. He has already been over the tracks you made and been back here, and now he has gone to look after the beaters." I washed and dressed and loaded my guns, and then we got into a sledge and started. The sharp frost still continued. It was quiet, and the sun could not be seen. There was a thick mist above us, and hoar frost still covered everything. After driving about 2 miles along the road as we came near the forest, we saw a cloud of smoke rising from a hollow and presently reached a group of peasants, both men and women, armed with cudgels. We got out and went up to them. The men sat roasting potatoes and laughing and talking with the women. Damien was there too, and when we arrived, the people got up, and Damien led them away to place them in the circle we had made the day before. They went along in single file, men and women, 30 in all. The snow was so deep that we could only see them from their waists upwards. They turned into the forest, and my friend and I followed in their track. Though they had trodden a path, walking was difficult, but, on the other hand, it was impossible to fall. It was like walking between 2 walls of snow. We went on in this way for nearly half a mile, when all at once we saw Damien coming from another direction, running towards us on his snowshoes and beckoning us to join him. We went towards him, and he showed us where to stand. I took my place and looked round me. To my left were tall fir trees, between the trunks of which I could see a good way, and, like a black patch just visible behind the trees, I could see a beater. In front of me was a thicket of young firs, about as high as a man, their branches weighed down and stuck together with snow. Through this copse ran a path thickly covered with snow and leading straight up to where I stood. The thicket stretched away to the right of me and ended in a small glade, where I could see Damien placing my comrade. I examined both my guns and considered where I had better stand. 3 steps behind me was a tall fir. "That's where I'll stand," thought I, "and then I can lean my second gun against the tree." And I moved towards the tree, sinking up to my knees in the snow at each step. I trod the snow down and made a clearance about a yard square to stand on. One gun I kept in my hand, the other, ready cocked, I placed leaning up against the tree. Then I unsheathed and replaced my dagger to make sure that I could draw it easily in case of need. Just as I had finished these preparations, I heard Damien shouting in the forest, "He's up! He's up!" And as soon as Damien shouted, the peasants round the circle all replied in their different voices, "Up, up, up!" "Uguhu!" shouted the men. "Aye!" screamed the women in high-pitched tones. The bear was inside the circle, and as Damien drove him on, the people all round kept shouting. Only my friend and I stood silent and motionless, waiting for the bear to come towards us. As I stood gazing and listening, my heart beat violently. I trembled, holding my gun fast. Now, I thought, he will come suddenly. I shall aim, fire, and he will drop. Suddenly to my left, but at a distance, I heard something falling on the snow. I looked between the tall fir trees, and some 50 paces off behind the trunks saw something big and black. I took aim and waited, thinking, won't he come any nearer? As I waited, I saw him move his ears, turn and go back, and then I caught a glimpse of the whole of him in profile. He was an immense brute. In my excitement, I fired and heard my bullet go flop against a tree. Peering through the smoke, I saw my bear scampering back into the circle and disappearing among the trees. Well, thought I, my chance is lost. He won't come back to me. Either my comrade will shoot him, or he will escape through the line of beaters. In any case, he won't give me another chance. I reloaded my gun, however, and again stood listening. The peasants were shouting all round, but to the right, not far from where my comrade stood, I heard a woman screaming in a frenzied voice. "Here he is! Here he is! Come here! Come here! Oh! I!" Evidently she could see the bear. I had given up expecting him and was looking to the right at my comrade. All at once I saw Damien with a stick in his hand and without his snowshoes, running along a footpath towards my friend. He crouched down beside him, pointing his stick as if aiming at something, and then I saw my friend raise his gun and aim in the same direction. Crack! He fired. There, thought I, he has killed him. But I saw that my comrade did not run towards the bear. Evidently he had missed him, or the shot had not taken full effect. The bear will get away, I thought. He will go back, but he won't come a second time towards me. But what is that? Something was coming towards me like a whirlwind, snorting as it came, and I saw the snow flying up quite near me. I glanced straight before me, and there was the bear, rushing along the path through the thicket right at me, evidently beside himself with fear. He was hardly half a dozen paces off, and I could see the whole of him, his black chest and enormous head with a reddish patch. There he was, blundering straight at me and scattering the snow about as he came. I could see by his eyes that he did not see me, but mad with fear, was rushing blindly along, and his path led him straight at the tree under which I was standing. I raised my gun and fired. He was almost upon me now, and I saw that I had missed. My bullet had gone past him, and he did not even hear me fire, but still came headlong towards me. I lowered my gun and fired again, almost touching his head. Crack! I had hit but not killed him. He raised his head, and laying his ears back came at me, showing his teeth. I snatched at my other gun, but almost before I had touched it, he had down at me and, knocking me over into the snow, had passed right over me. Thank goodness, he has left me, thought I. I tried to rise, but something pressed me down and prevented my getting up. The bear's rush had carried him past me, but he had turned back and had fallen on me with the whole weight of his body. I felt something heavy weighing me down and something warm above my face, and I realized that he was drawing my whole face into his mouth. My nose was already in it, and I felt the heat of it and smelt his blood. He was pressing my shoulders down with his paws so that I could not move. All I could do was to draw my head down towards my chest, away from his mouth, trying to free my nose and eyes while he tried to get his teeth into them. Then I felt that he had seized my forehead just under the hair with the teeth of his lower jaw, and the flesh below my eyes with his upper jaw, and was closing his teeth. It was as if my face were being cut with knives. I struggled to get away, while he made haste to close his jaws like a dog gnawing. I managed to twist my face away, but he began drawing it again into his mouth. Now, thought I, my end has come. Then I felt the weight lifted, and looking up, I saw that he was no longer there. He had jumped off me and run away. When my comrade and Damien had seen the bear knock me down and begin worrying me, they rushed to the rescue. My comrade, in his haste, blundered, and instead of following the trodden path, ran into the deep snow and fell down. While he was struggling out of the snow, the bear was gnawing at me. But Damien, just as he was, without a gun and with only a stick in his hand, rushed along the path shouting, "He's eating the master! He's eating the master!" And as he ran, he called to the bear, "Oh, you idiot! What are you doing? Leave off! Leave off!" The bear obeyed him, and leaving me ran away. When I rose, there was as much blood on the snow as if a sheep had been killed, and the flesh hung in rags above my eyes, though in my excitement I felt no pain. My comrade had come up by this time, and the other people collected round. They looked at my wound and put snow on it. But I, forgetting about my wounds, only asked, "Where's the bear? Which way has he gone?" Suddenly I heard, "Here he is! Here he is!" And we saw the bear again running at us. We seized our guns, but before anyone had time to fire, he had run past. He had grown ferocious and wanted to gnaw me again, but seeing so many people, he took fright. We saw by his track that his head was bleeding, and we wanted to follow him up. But as my wounds had become very painful, we went instead to the town to find a doctor. The doctor stitched up my wounds with silk, and they soon began to heal. A month later, we went to hunt that bear again, but I did not get a chance of finishing him. He would not come out of the circle, but went round and round, growling in a terrible voice. Damien killed him. The bear's lower jaw had been broken, and one of his teeth knocked out by my bullet. He was a huge creature and had splendid black fur. I had him stuffed, and he now lies in my room. The wounds on my forehead healed up, so that the scars can scarcely be seen.
Part 2. Popular Stories. Fourth story. What Men Live By. We know that we have passed out of death into life because we love the brethren. He that loveth not abideth in death. First Epistle Saint John chapter 3. Verse 14, Whoso hath the world's goods, and beholdeth his brother in need, and shutteth up his compassion from him, how doth the love of God abide in him? My little children, let us not love in word, neither with the tongue, but in deed and truth. Chapter 3, verses 17 through 18. Love is of God, and every one that loveth is begotten of God, and knoweth God. He that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. Chapter 4, verses 7 through 8. No man hath beheld God at any time. If we love one another, God abideth in us. Chapter 4, 12. God is love, and he that abideth in love abideth in God, and God abideth in him. Chapter 16. If a man say, I love God, and hateth his brother, he is a liar. For he that loveth not his brother whom he hath seen, how can he love God whom he hath not seen? Chapter 20. A shoemaker named Simon, who had neither house nor land of his own, lived with his wife and children in a peasant's hut, and earned his living by his work. Work was cheap, but bread was dear, and what he earned he spent for food. The man and his wife had but one sheepskin coat between them for winter wear, and even that was worn to tatters, and this was the second year he had been wanting to buy sheepskins for a new coat. Before winter, Simon saved up a little money. A 3-ruble note lay hidden in his wife's box, and 5 rubles and 20 kopecks were owed him by customers in the village. So one morning he prepared to go to the village to buy the sheepskins. He put on over his shirt his wife's wadded nankeen jacket, and over that he put his own cloth coat. He took the 3-ruble note in his pocket, cut himself a stick to serve as a staff, and started off after breakfast. I'll collect the 5 rubles that are due to me, thought he. Add the 3 I have got, and that will be enough to buy sheepskins for the winter coat. He came to the village and called at a peasant's hut. But the man was not at home. The peasant's wife promised that the money should be paid next week, but she would not pay it herself. Then Simon called on another peasant, but this one swore he had no money, and would only pay 20 kopecks which he owed for a pair of boots Simon had mended. Simon then tried to buy the sheepskins on credit, but the debtor would not trust him. Bring your money, said he. Then you may have your pick of the skins. We know what debt collecting is like. So all the business the shoemaker did was to get the 20 kopecks for boots he had mended, and to take a pair of felt boots a peasant gave him to sole with leather. Simon felt downhearted. He spent the 20 kopecks on vodka, and started homewards without having bought any skins. In the morning he had felt the frost, but now, after drinking the vodka, he felt warm even without a sheepskin coat. He trudged along, striking his stick on the frozen earth with one hand, swinging the felt boots with the other, and talking to himself. I'm quite warm, said he, though I have no sheepskin coat. I've had a drop, and it runs through all my veins. I need no sheepskins. I go along and don't worry about anything. That's the sort of man I am. What do I care? I can live without sheepskins. I don't need them. My wife will fret, to be sure. And true enough, it's a shame. One works all day long and then does not get paid. Stop a bit. If you don't bring that money along, sure enough, I'll skin you, blessed if I don't. How's that? He pays 20 kopecks at a time. What can I do with 20 kopecks? Drink it. That's all one can do. Hard up. He says he is. So he may be. But what about me? You have house and cattle and everything. I've only what I stand up in. You have corn of your own growing. I have to buy every grain. Do what I will, I must spend 3 rubles every week for bread alone. I come home and find the bread all used up, and I have to fork out another 1.5 rubles. So just you pay up what you owe, and no nonsense about it. By this time he had nearly reached the shrine at the bend of the road. Looking up, he saw something whitish behind the shrine. The daylight was fading, and the shoemaker peered at the thing without being able to make out what it was. There was no white stone here before. Can it be an ox? It's not like an ox. It has a head like a man, but it's too white. And what could a man be doing there? He came closer, so that it was clearly visible. To his surprise, it really was a man, alive or dead, sitting naked, leaning motionless against the shrine. Terror seized the shoemaker, and he thought, "Someone has killed him, stripped him, and left him here. If I meddle, I shall surely get into trouble." So the shoemaker went on. He passed in front of the shrine so that he could not see the man. When he had gone some way, he looked back and saw that the man was no longer leaning against the shrine, but was moving as if looking towards him. The shoemaker felt more frightened than before, and thought, "Shall I go back to him, or shall I go on? If I go near him, something dreadful may happen. Who knows who the fellow is? He has not come here for any good. If I go near him, he may jump up and throttle me, and there will be no getting away. Or if not, he'd still be a burden on one's hands. What could I do with a naked man? I couldn't give him my last clothes. Heaven only help me to get away." So the shoemaker hurried on, leaving the shrine behind him, when suddenly his conscience smote him, and he stopped in the road. "What are you doing, Simon?" said he to himself. "The man may be dying of want, and you slip past afraid. Have you grown so rich as to be afraid of robbers? Ah, Simon, shame on you!" So he turned back and went up to the man. Simon approached the stranger, looked at him, and saw that he was a young man, fit, with no bruises on his body, only evidently freezing and frightened, and he sat there leaning back without looking up at Simon, as if too faint to lift his eyes. Simon went close to him, and then the man seemed to wake up. Turning his head, he opened his eyes and looked into Simon's face. That one look was enough to make Simon fond of the man. He threw the felt boots on the ground, undid his sash, laid it on the boots, and took off his cloth coat. "It's not a time for talking," said he. "Come, put this coat on at once." And Simon took the man by the elbows and helped him to rise. As he stood there, Simon saw that his body was clean and in good condition, his hands and feet shapely, and his face good and kind. He threw his coat over the man's shoulders, but the latter could not find the sleeves. Simon guided his arms into them, and drawing the coat well on, trapped it closely about him, tying the sash round the man's waist. Simon even took off his torn cap to put it on the man's head, but then his own head felt cold, and he thought, "I'm quite bald, while he has long curly hair." So he put his cap on his own head again. "It will be better to give him something for his feet," thought he, and he made the man sit down and helped him to put on the felt boots, saying, "There, friend, now move about and warm yourself. Other matters can be settled later on. Can you walk?" The man stood up and looked kindly at Simon, but could not say a word. "Why don't you speak?" said Simon. "It's too cold to stay here. We must be getting home. There now, take my stick, and if you're feeling weak, lean on that. Now step out." The man started walking and moved easily, not lagging behind. As they went along, Simon asked him, "And where do you belong to?" "I'm not from these parts. I thought as much. I know the folks hereabouts. But how did you come to be there by the shrine? I cannot tell. Has someone been ill-treating you?" "No one has ill-treated me. God has punished me. Of course God rules all. Still, you'll have to find food and shelter somewhere. Where do you want to go to?" "It is all the same to me." Simon was amazed. The man did not look like a rogue, and he spoke gently, but yet he gave no account of himself. Still, Simon thought, who knows what may have happened? And he said to the stranger, "Well then, come home with me, and at least warm yourself a while." So Simon walked towards his home, and the stranger kept up with him, walking at his side. The wind had risen, and Simon felt it cold under his shirt. He was getting over his tipsiness by now, and began to feel the frost. He went along, sniffling and wrapping his wife's coat round him, and he thought to himself, "There now, talk about sheepskins. I went out for sheepskins and come home without even a coat to my back, and what is more, I'm bringing a naked man along with me. Matryona won't be pleased." And when he thought of his wife, he felt sad. But when he looked at the stranger and remembered how he had looked up at him at the shrine, his heart was glad. Simon's wife had everything ready early that day. She had cut wood, brought water, fed the children, eaten her own meal, and now she sat thinking. She wondered when she ought to make bread, now or tomorrow. There was still a large piece left. If Simon has had some dinner in town, thought she, and does not eat much for supper, the bread will last out another day. She weighed the piece of bread in her hand again and again and thought, I won't make any more today. We have only enough flour left to bake one batch. We can manage to make this last out till Friday. So Matryona put away the bread and sat down at the table to patch her husband's shirt. While she worked, she thought how her husband was buying skins for a winter coat. If only the dealer does not cheat him. My good man is much too simple. He cheats nobody, but any child can take him in. 8 rubles is a lot of money. He should get a good coat at that price. Not tanned skins, but still a proper winter coat. How difficult it was last winter to get on without a warm coat. I could neither get down to the river, nor go out anywhere. When he went out, he put on all we had, and there was nothing left for me. He did not start very early today, but still it's time he was back. I only hope he has not gone on the spree. Hardly had Matryona thought this, when steps were heard on the threshold, and someone entered. Matryona stuck her needle into her work and went out into the passage. There she saw 2 men, Simon, and with him a man without a hat and wearing felt boots. Matryona noticed at once that her husband smelt of spirits. There now, he has been drinking, thought she. And when she saw that he was coatless, had only her jacket on, brought no parcel, stood there silent and seemed ashamed, her heart was ready to break with disappointment. He has drunk the money, thought she, and has been on the spree with some good-for-nothing fellow whom he has brought home with him. Matryona let them pass into the hut, followed them in, and saw that the stranger was a young, slight man, wearing her husband's coat. There was no shirt to be seen under it, and he had no hat. Having entered, he stood neither moving nor raising his eyes, and Matryona thought, he must be a bad man. He's afraid. Matryona frowned, and stood beside the oven looking to see what they would do. Simon took off his cap and sat down on the bench as if things were all right. Come, Matryona, if supper is ready, let us have some. Matryona muttered something to herself and did not move, but stayed where she was, by the oven. She looked first at the one and then at the other of them, and only shook her head. Simon saw that his wife was annoyed, but tried to pass it off. Pretending not to notice anything, he took the stranger by the arm. "Sit down, friend," said he, "and let us have some supper." The stranger sat down on the bench. "Haven't you cooked anything for us?" said Simon. Matryona's anger boiled over. "I've cooked, but not for you. It seems to me you have drunk your wits away. You went to buy a sheepskin coat, but come home without so much as the coat you had on, and bring a naked vagabond home with you. I have no supper for drunkards like you. That's enough, Matryona. Don't wag your tongue without reason. You had better ask what sort of man. And you tell me what you've done with the money?" Simon found the pocket of the jacket, drew out the 3-ruble note, and unfolded it. "Here is the money. Trifonov did not pay, but promises to pay soon." Matryona got still more angry. He had bought no sheepskins, but had put his only coat on some naked fellow, and had even brought him to their house. She snatched up the note from the table, took it to put away in safety, and said, "I have no supper for you. We can't feed all the naked drunkards in the world." "There now, Matryona, hold your tongue a bit. First, hear what a man has to say." "Much wisdom I shall hear from a drunken fool. I was right in not wanting to marry you, a drunkard. The linen my mother gave me you drank, and now you've been to buy a coat, and have drunk it too." Simon tried to explain to his wife that he had only spent 20 kopecks, tried to tell how he had found the man, but Matryona would not let him get a word in. She talked 19 to the dozen and dragged in things that had happened 10 years before. Matryona talked, and at last she flew at Simon and seized him by the sleeve. "Give me my jacket. It is the only one I have, and you must needs take it from me and wear it yourself. Give it here, you mangy dog, and may the devil take you." Simon began to pull off the jacket, and turned a sleeve of it inside out. Matryona seized the jacket, and it burst its seams. She snatched it up, threw it over her head, and went to the door. She meant to go out, but stopped undecided. She wanted to work off her anger, but she also wanted to learn what sort of a man the stranger was. Matryona stopped and said, "If he were a good man, he would not be naked. Why, he hasn't even a shirt on him. If he were all right, you would say where you came across the fellow." "That's just what I am trying to tell you," said Simon. "As I came to the shrine, I saw him sitting all naked and frozen. It isn't quite the weather to sit about naked. God sent me to him, or he would have perished. What was I to do? How do we know what may have happened to him? So I took him, clothed him, and brought him along. Don't be so angry, Matryona. It is a sin. Remember, we all must die one day." Angry words rose to Matryona's lips, but she looked at the stranger and was silent. He sat on the edge of the bench, motionless, his hands folded on his knees, his head drooping on his breast, his eyes closed, and his brows knit as if in pain. Matryona was silent, and Simon said, "Matryona, have you no love of God?" Matryona heard these words, and as she looked at the stranger, suddenly her heart softened towards him. She came back from the door, and going to the oven she got out the supper. Setting a cup on the table, she poured out some kvass. Then she brought out the last piece of bread, and set out a knife and spoons. "Eat if you want to," said she. Simon drew the stranger to the table. "Take your place, young man," said he. Simon cut the bread, crumbled it into the broth, and they began to eat. Matryona sat at the corner of the table, resting her head on her hand and looking at the stranger. And Matryona was touched with pity for the stranger, and began to feel fond of him. And at once the stranger's face lit up. His brows were no longer bent. He raised his eyes and smiled at Matryona. When they had finished supper, the woman cleared away the things and began questioning the stranger. "Where are you from?" said she. "I am not from these parts." "But how did you come to be on the road?" "I may not tell." "Did someone rob you? God punished me? And you were lying there naked?" "Yes, naked and freezing. Simon saw me and had pity on me. He took off his coat, put it on me, and brought me here. And you have fed me, given me drink, and shown pity on me. God will reward you." Matryona rose, took from the window Simon's old shirt she had been patching, and gave it to the stranger. She also brought out a pair of trousers for him. "There," said she, "I see you have no shirt. Put this on and lie down where you please, in the loft or on the oven." The stranger took off the coat, put on the shirt, and lay down in the loft. Matryona put out the candle, took the coat, and climbed to where her husband lay. Matryona drew the skirts of the coat over her and lay down, but could not sleep. She could not get the stranger out of her mind. When she remembered that he had eaten their last piece of bread and that there was none for tomorrow, and thought of the shirt and trousers she had given away, she felt grieved. But when she remembered how he had smiled, her heart was glad. Long did Matryona lie awake, and she noticed that Simon also was awake. He drew the coat towards him. "Simon! Well, you have had the last of the bread, and I have not put any to rise. I don't know what we shall do tomorrow. Perhaps I can borrow some of neighbor Martha. If we're alive, we shall find something to eat." The woman lay still a while, and then said, "He seems a good man, but why does he not tell us who he is? I suppose he has his reasons?" "Simon? Well, we give, but why does nobody give us anything?" Simon did not know what to say, so he only said, "Let us stop talking," and turned over and went to sleep. In the morning Simon awoke. The children were still asleep. His wife had gone to the neighbor's to borrow some bread. The stranger alone was sitting on the bench, dressed in the old shirt and trousers, and looking upwards. His face was brighter than it had been the day before. Simon said to him, "Well, friend, the belly wants bread and the naked body clothes. One has to work for a living. What work do you know?" "I do not know any." This surprised Simon, but he said, "Men who want to learn can learn anything. Men work, and I will work also. What is your name?" "Michael." "Well, Michael, if you don't wish to talk about yourself, that is your own affair, but you'll have to earn a living for yourself. If you will work as I tell you, I will give you food and shelter. May God reward you. I will learn. Show me what to do." Simon took yarn, put it round his thumb, and began to twist it. "It is easy enough. See?" Michael watched him, put some yarn round his own thumb in the same way, caught the knack, and twisted the yarn also. Then Simon showed him how to wax the thread. This also Michael mastered. Next Simon showed him how to twist the bristle in, and how to sew, and this too Michael learned at once. Whatever Simon showed him, he understood at once, and after 3 days he worked as if he had sewn boots all his life. He worked without stopping, and ate little. When work was over, he sat silently, looking upwards. He hardly went into the street, spoke only when necessary, and neither joked nor laughed. They never saw him smile, except that first evening when Matryona gave them supper. Day by day and week by week the year went round. Michael lived and worked with Simon. His fame spread till people said that no one sewed boots so neatly and strongly as Simon's workman, Michael. And from all the district round people came to Simon for their boots, and he began to be well off. One winter day, as Simon and Michael sat working a carriage on sledge-runners, with 3 horses and with bells, drove up to the hut. They looked out of the window. The carriage stopped at their door. A fine servant jumped down from the box and opened the door. A gentleman in a fur coat got out and walked up to Simon's hut. Up jumped Matryona and opened the door wide. The gentleman stooped to enter the hut, and when he drew himself up again his head nearly reached the ceiling, and he seemed quite to fill his end of the room. Simon rose, bowed, and looked at the gentleman with astonishment. He had never seen anyone like him. Simon himself was lean, Michael was thin, and Matryona was dry as a bone, but this man was like someone from another world. Red-faced, burly, with a neck like a bull's, and looking altogether as if he were cast in iron. The gentleman puffed, threw off his fur coat, sat down on the bench, and said, "Which of you is the master bootmaker?" "I am, your Excellency," said Simon, coming forward. Then the gentleman shouted to his lad, "Hey, Fedka, bring the leather." The servant ran in bringing a parcel. The gentleman took the parcel and put it on the table. "Untie it," said he. The lad untied it. The gentleman pointed to the leather. "Look here, shoemaker," said he. "Do you see this leather?" "Yes, your honor." "But do you know what sort of leather it is?" Simon felt the leather and said, "It is good leather." "Good, indeed. Why, you fool, you never saw such leather before in your life. It's German and cost 20 rubles. Simon was frightened and said, "Where should I ever see leather like that?" "Just so. Now, can you make it into boots for me?" "Yes, your Excellency, I can." Then the gentleman shouted at him, "You can you? Well, remember whom you are to make them for, and what the leather is. You must make me boots that will wear for a year, neither losing shape nor coming unsewn. If you can do it, take the leather and cut it up, but if you can't, say so. I warn you now, if your boots come unsewn or lose shape within a year, I will have you put in prison. If they don't burst or lose shape for a year, I will pay you 10 rubles for your work." Simon was frightened, and did not know what to say. He glanced at Michael, and nudging him with his elbow, whispered, "Shall I take the work?" Michael nodded his head as if to say, "Yes, take it." Simon did as Michael advised, and undertook to make boots that would not lose shape or split for a whole year. Calling his servant, the gentleman told him to pull the boot off his left leg, which he stretched out. "Take my measure," said he. Simon stitched a paper measure 17 inches long, smoothed it out, knelt down, wiped his hands well on his apron so as not to soil the gentleman's sock, and began to measure. He measured the sole, and round the instep, and began to measure the calf of the leg, but the paper was too short. The calf of the leg was as thick as a beam. "Mind you don't make it too tight in the leg." Simon stitched on another strip of paper. The gentleman twitched his toes about in his sock, looking round at those in the hut, and as he did so he noticed Michael. "Whom have you there?" asked he. "That is my workman. He will sew the boots." "Mind," said the gentleman to Michael, "remember to make them so that they will last me a year." Simon also looked at Michael, and saw that Michael was not looking at the gentleman, but was gazing into the corner behind the gentleman as if he saw someone there. Michael looked, and suddenly he smiled, and his face became brighter. "What are you grinning at, you fool?" thundered the gentleman. "You had better look to it that the boots are ready in time." "They shall be ready in good time," said Michael. "Mind it is so," said the gentleman, and he put on his boots and his fur coat, wrapped the latter round him, and went to the door. But he forgot to stoop and struck his head against the lintel. He swore and rubbed his head. Then he took his seat in the carriage and drove away. When he had gone, Simon said, "There's a figure of a man for you. You could not kill him with a mallet. He almost knocked out the lintel, but little harm it did him." And Matryona said, "Living as he does, how should he not grow strong? Death itself can't touch such a rock as that." Then Simon said to Michael, "Well, we have taken the work, but we must see we don't get into trouble over it. The leather is dear, and the gentleman hot-tempered. We must make no mistakes. Come, your eye is truer, and your hands have become nimbler than mine, so you take this measure and cut out the boots. I will finish off the sewing of the vamps." Michael did as he was told. He took the leather, spread it out on the table, folded it in two, took a knife and began to cut out. Matryona came and watched him cutting, and was surprised to see how he was doing it. Matryona was accustomed to seeing boots made, and she looked and saw that Michael was not cutting the leather for boots, but was cutting it round. She wished to say something, but she thought to herself, "Perhaps I do not understand how gentlemen's boots should be made. I suppose Michael knows more about it, and I won't interfere." When Michael had cut up the leather, he took a thread and began to sew, not with two ends, as boots are sewn, but with a single end, as for soft slippers. Again Matryona wondered, but again she did not interfere. Michael sewed on steadily till noon. Then Simon rose for dinner, looked around, and saw that Michael had made slippers out of the gentleman's leather. "Ah," groaned Simon, and he thought, "How is it that Michael, who has been with me a whole year and never made a mistake before, should do such a dreadful thing?" The gentleman ordered high boots, welted with whole fronts, and Michael has made soft slippers with single soles, and has wasted the leather. What am I to say to the gentleman? I can never replace leather such as this. And he said to Michael, "What are you doing, friend? You have ruined me. You know the gentleman ordered high booth, but see what you have made." Hardly had he begun to rebuke Michael when, rat-tat, went the iron ring that hung at the door. Someone was knocking. They looked out of the window. A man had come on horseback and was fastening his horse. They opened the door, and the servant who had been with the gentleman came in. "Good day," said he. "Good day," replied Simon. "What can we do for you?" "My mistress has sent me about the boots." "What about the boots?" "Why, my master no longer needs them. He is dead." "Is it possible?" "He did not live to get home after leaving you, but died in the carriage. When we reached home and the servants came to help him alight, he rolled over like a sack. He was dead already, and so stiff that he could hardly be got out of the carriage. My mistress sent me here, saying, 'Tell the bootmaker that the gentleman who ordered boots of him and left the leather for them no longer needs the boots, but that he must quickly make soft slippers for the corpse. Wait till they are ready and bring them back with you. That is why I have come.'" Michael gathered up the remnants of the leather, rolled them up, took the soft slippers he had made, slapped them together, wiped them down with his apron, and handed them and the roll of leather to the servant, who took them and said, "Good-bye, masters, and good day to you." Another year passed, and another, and Michael was now living his 6th year with Simon. He lived as before. He went nowhere, only spoke when necessary, and had only smiled twice in all those years, once when Matryona gave him food, and a second time when the gentleman was in their hut. Simon was more than pleased with his workman. He never now asked him where he came from, and only feared lest Michael should go away. They were all at home one day. Matryona was putting iron pots in the oven. The children were running along the benches and looking out of the window. Simon was sewing at one window, and Michael was fastening on a heel at the other. One of the boys ran along the bench to Michael, leant on his shoulder, and looked out of the window. "Look, Uncle Michael, there is a lady with little girls. She seems to be coming here, and one of the girls is lame." When the boy said that, Michael dropped his work, turned to the window, and looked out into the street. Simon was surprised. Michael never used to look out into the street, but now he pressed against the window, staring at something. Simon also looked out and saw that a well-dressed woman was really coming to his hut, leading by the hand two little girls in fur coats and woolen shawls. The girls could hardly be told one from the other, except that one of them was crippled in her left leg and walked with a limp. The woman stepped into the porch and entered the passage. Feeling about for the entrance, she found the latch, which she lifted and opened the door. She let the two girls go in first and followed them into the hut. "Good day, good folk." "Pray come in," said Simon. "What can we do for you?" The woman sat down by the table. The two little girls pressed close to her knees, afraid of the people in the hut. "I want leather shoes made for these two little girls, for spring." "We can do that. We never have made such small shoes, but we can make them, either welted or turnover shoes, linen-lined. My man, Michael, is a master at the work." Simon glanced at Michael and saw that he had left his work and was sitting with his eyes fixed on the little girls. Simon was surprised. It was true the girls were pretty, with black eyes, plump and rosy-cheeked, and they wore nice kerchiefs and fur coats, but still Simon could not understand why Michael should look at them like that, just as if he had known them before. He was puzzled, but went on talking with the woman and arranging the price. Having fixed it, he prepared the measure. The woman lifted the lame girl onto her lap and said, "Take 2 measures from this little girl. Make 1 shoe for the lame foot and 3 for the sound one. They both have the same sized feet. They are twins." Simon took the measure and, speaking of the lame girl, said, "How did it happen to her? She is such a pretty girl. Was she born so?" "No, her mother crushed her leg." Then Matryona joined in. She wondered who this woman was and whose the children were. So she said, "Are not you their mother, then?" "No, my good woman. I am neither their mother, nor any relation to them. They were quite strangers to me, but I adopted them. They are not your children, and yet you are so fond of them. How can I help being fond of them? I fed them both at my own breasts. I had a child of my own, but God took him. I was not so fond of him as I now am of them. Then whose children are they?" The woman, having begun talking, told them the whole story. "It is about 6 years since their parents died, both in 1 week. Their father was buried on the Tuesday, and their mother died on the Friday. These orphans were born 3 days after their father's death, and their mother did not live another day. My husband and I were then living as peasants in the village. We were neighbors of theirs, our yard being next to theirs. Their father was a lonely man, a woodcutter in the forest. When felling trees one day, they let one fall on him. It fell across his body and crushed his bowels out. They hardly got him home before his soul went to God. And that same week his wife gave birth to twins, these little girls. She was poor and alone. She had no one, young or old, with her. Alone she gave them birth, and alone she met her death. The next morning I went to see her, but when I entered the hut she, poor thing, was already stark and cold. In dying she had rolled onto this child and crushed her leg. The village folk came to the hut, washed the body, laid her out, made a coffin, and buried her. They were good folk. The babies were left alone. What was to be done with them? I was the only woman there who had a baby at the time. I was nursing my firstborn, 8 weeks old, so I took them for a time. The peasants came together and thought what to do with them, and at last they said to me, "For the present, Mary, you had better keep the girls, and later on we will arrange what to do for them." So I nursed the sound one at my breast, but at first I did not feed this crippled one. I did not suppose she would live. But then I thought to myself, why should the poor innocent suffer? I pitied her and began to feed her. And so I fed my own boy, and these two, the 3 of them, at my own breast. I was young and strong and had good food, and God gave me so much milk that at times it even overflowed. I used sometimes to feed 2 at a time, while the third was waiting. When one had had enough, I nursed the third. And God so ordered it that these grew up, while my own was buried before he was 2 years old, and I had no more children, though we prospered. Now my husband is working for the corn merchant at the mill. The pay is good, and we are well off, but I have no children of my own, and how lonely I should be without these little girls. How can I help loving them? They are the joy of my life." She pressed the lame little girl to her with one hand, while with the other she wiped the tears from her cheeks. And Matryona sighed and said, "The proverb is true that says, 'One may live without father or mother, but one cannot live without God.'" So they talked together, when suddenly the whole hut was lighted up as though by summer lightning from the corner where Michael sat. They all looked towards him and saw him sitting, his hands folded on his knees, gazing upwards and smiling. The woman went away with the girls. Michael rose from the bench, put down his work, and took off his apron. Then, bowing low to Simon and his wife, he said, "Farewell, masters, God has forgiven me. I ask your forgiveness, too, for anything done amiss." And they saw that a light shone from Michael. And Simon rose, bowed down to Michael, and said, "I see, Michael, that you are no common man, and I can neither keep you nor question you. Only tell me this. How is it that when I found you and brought you home, you were gloomy, and when my wife gave you food you smiled at her and became brighter? Then, when the gentleman came to order the boots, you smiled again and became brighter still? And now, when this woman brought the little girls, you smiled a third time, and have become as bright as day? Tell me, Michael, why does your face shine so, and why did you smile those 3 times? And Michael answered, "Light shines from me because I have been punished, but now God has pardoned me. And I smiled 3 times, because God sent me to learn 3 truths, and I have learnt them. One I learnt when your wife pitied me, and that is why I smiled the first time. The second I learnt when the rich man ordered the boots, and then I smiled again. And now, when I saw those little girls, I learnt the third and last truth, and I smiled the 3rd time." And Simon said, "Tell me, Michael, what did God punish you for, and what were the 3 truths? That I too may know them." And Michael answered, "God punished me for disobeying him. I was an angel in heaven and disobeyed God. God sent me to fetch a woman's soul. I flew to earth and saw a sick woman lying alone who had just given birth to twin girls. They moved feebly at their mother's side, but she could not lift them to her breast. When she saw me, she understood that God had sent me for her soul, and she wept and said, 'Angel of God, my husband has just been buried, killed by a falling tree. I have neither sister, nor aunt, nor mother, no one to care for my orphans. Do not take my soul. Let me nurse my babes, feed them, and set them on their feet before I die. Children cannot live without father or mother.' And I hearkened to her. I placed one child at her breast and gave the other into her arms, and returned to the Lord in heaven. I flew to the Lord and said, 'I could not take the soul of the mother. Her husband was killed by a tree. The woman has twins, and prays that her soul may not be taken. She says, "Let me nurse and feed my children, and set them on their feet. Children cannot live without father or mother. I have not taken her soul." And God said, "Go, take the mother's soul, and learn 3 truths. Learn what dwells in man, what is not given to man, and what men live by. When thou hast learnt these things, thou shalt return to heaven." So I flew again to earth and took the mother's soul. The babes dropped from her breasts. Her body rolled over on the bed and crushed one babe, twisting its leg. I rose above the village, wishing to take her soul to God, but a wind seized me, and my wings drooped and dropped off. Her soul rose alone to God, while I fell to earth by the roadside. And Simon and Matryona understood who it was that had lived with them, and whom they had clothed and fed. And they wept with awe and with joy. And the angel said, "I was alone in the field, naked. I had never known human needs, cold and hunger, till I became a man. I was famished, frozen, and did not know what to do. I saw near the field I was in a shrine built for God, and I went to it hoping to find shelter. But the shrine was locked, and I could not enter. So I sat down behind the shrine to shelter myself at least from the wind. Evening drew on. I was hungry, frozen, and in pain. Suddenly I heard a man coming along the road. He carried a pair of boots, and was talking to himself. For the first time since I became a man, I saw the mortal face of a man, and his face seemed terrible to me, and I turned from it. And I heard the man talking to himself of how to cover his body from the cold in winter, and how to feed wife and children. And I thought, I am perishing of cold and hunger, and here is a man thinking only of how to clothe himself and his wife, and how to get bread for themselves. He cannot help me. When the man saw me, he frowned and became still more terrible, and passed me by on the other side. I despaired, but suddenly I heard him coming back. I looked up, and did not recognize the same man. Before, I had seen death in his face, but now he was alive, and I recognized in him the presence of God. He came up to me, clothed me, took me with him, and brought me to his home. I entered the house. A woman came to meet us, and began to speak. The woman was still more terrible than the man had been. The spirit of death came from her mouth. I could not breathe for the stench of death that spread around her. She wished to drive me out into the cold, and I knew that if she did so, she would die. Suddenly her husband spoke to her of God, and the woman changed at once. And when she brought me food and looked at me, I glanced at her and saw that death no longer dwelt in her. She had become alive. And in her, too, I saw God. Then I remembered the first lesson God had set me. Learn what dwells in man. And I understood that in man dwells love. I was glad that God had already begun to show me what he had promised, and I smiled for the first time. But I had not yet learnt all. I did not yet know what is not given to man, and what men live by. I lived with you, and a year passed. A man came to order boots that should wear for a year without losing shape or cracking. I looked at him, and suddenly, behind his shoulder, I saw my comrade, the angel of death. None but me saw that angel, but I knew him, and knew that before the sun set he would take that rich man's soul. And I thought to myself, the man is making preparations for a year, and does not know that he will die before evening. And I remembered God's second saying, learn what is not given to man. What dwells in man I already knew. Now I learnt what is not given him. It is not given to man to know his own needs. And I smiled for the second time. I was glad to have seen my comrade angel. Glad also that God had revealed to me the second saying. But I still did not know all. I did not know what men live by. And I lived on, waiting till God should reveal to me the last lesson. In the 6th year came the girl twins with the woman, and I recognized the girls and heard how they had been kept alive. Having heard the story, I thought, their mother besought me for the children's sake, and I believed her when she said that children cannot live without father or mother, but a stranger has nursed them, and has brought them up. And when the woman showed her love for the children that were not her own, and wept over them, I saw in her the living God, and understood what men live by. And I knew that God had revealed to me the last lesson, and had forgiven my sin. And then I smiled for the 3rd time. And the angel's body was bared, and he was clothed in light, so that I could not look on him. And his voice grew louder, as though it came not from him but from heaven above. And the angel said, I have learnt that all men live not by care for themselves, but by love. It was not given to the mother to know what her children needed for their life, nor was it given to the rich man to know what he himself needed, nor is it given to any man to know whether, when evening comes, he will need boots for his body or slippers for his corpse. I remained alive when I was a man, not by care of myself, but because love was present in a passer-by, and because he and his wife pitied and loved me. The orphans remained alive, not because of their mother's care, but because there was love in the heart of a woman, a stranger to them, who pitied and loved them. And all men live not by the thought they spend on their own welfare, but because love exists in man. I knew before that God gave life to men and desires that they should live. Now I understood more than that. I understood that God does not wish men to live apart, and therefore He does not reveal to them what each one needs for himself, but He wishes them to live united, and therefore reveals to each of them what is necessary for all. I have now understood that though it seems to men that they live by care for themselves, in truth, it is love alone by which they live. He who has love is in God, and God is in him, for God is love. And the angels sang praise to God, so that the hut trembled at his voice. The roof opened, and a column of fire rose from earth to heaven. Simon and his wife and children fell to the ground. Wings appeared upon the angel's shoulders, and he rose into the heavens. And when Simon came to himself, the hut stood as before, and there was no one in it but his own family.
Fifth story, a spark neglected burns the house. Then came Peter, and said to him, Lord, how oft shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Until 7 times? Jesus saith unto him, I say not unto thee, until 7 times, but, until 70 times 7. Therefore is the kingdom of heaven likened unto a certain king, which would make a reckoning with his servants. And when he had begun to reckon, one was brought unto him, which owed him 10,000 talents. But forasmuch as he had not wherewith to pay, his lord commanded him to be sold, and his wife, and children, and all that he had, and payment to be made. The servant therefore fell down and worshipped him, saying, Lord, have patience with me, and I will pay thee all. And the lord of that servant, being moved with compassion, released him, and forgave him the debt. But that servant went out, and found one of his fellow servants, which owed him 100 pence, and he laid hold on him, and took him by the throat, saying, Pay what thou owest. So his fellow servant fell down and besought him, saying, Have patience with me, and I will pay thee. And he would not, but went and cast him into prison, till he should pay that which was due. So when his fellow servants saw what was done, they were exceeding sorry, and came and told unto their lord all that was done. Then his lord called him unto him, and saith to him, Thou wicked servant, I forgave thee all that debt, because thou besoughtest me. Shouldest not thou also have had mercy on thy fellow servant, even as I had mercy on thee? And his lord was wroth, and delivered him to the tormentors, till he should pay all that was due. So shall also my heavenly Father do unto you, if ye forgive not every one his brother from your hearts. Matt 18:21-35. There once lived in a village a peasant named Ivan Shcherbakov. He was comfortably off, in the prime of life, the best worker in the village, and had 3 sons all able to work. The eldest was married, the second about to marry, and the third was a big lad who could mind the horses and was already beginning to plow. Ivan's wife was an able and thrifty woman, and they were fortunate in having a quiet, hard-working daughter-in-law. There was nothing to prevent Ivan and his family from living happily. They had only one idle mouth to feed, that was Ivan's old father, who suffered from asthma and had been lying ill on the top of the brick oven for 7 years. Ivan had all he needed, 3 horses and a colt, a cow with a calf, and 15 sheep. The women made all the clothing for the family, besides helping in the fields, and the men tilled the land. They always had grain enough of their own to last over beyond the next harvest and sold enough oats to pay the taxes and meet their other needs. So Ivan and his children might have lived quite comfortably had it not been for a feud between him and his next-door neighbor, Limping Gabriel, the son of Gordy Ivanov. As long as old Gordy was alive and Ivan's father was still able to manage the household, the peasants lived as neighbors should. If the women of either house happened to want a sieve or a tub, or the men required a sack, or if a cartwheel got broken and could not be mended at once, they used to send to the other house, and helped each other in neighborly fashion. When a calf strayed into the neighbor's thrashing ground, they would just drive it out, and only say, Don't let it get in again. Our grain is lying there. And such things as locking up the barns and outhouses, hiding things from one another, or backbiting were never thought of in those days. That was in the father's time. When the sons came to be at the head of the families, everything changed. It all began about a trifle. Ivan's daughter-in-law had a hen that began laying rather early in the season, and she started collecting its eggs for Easter. Every day she went to the cart shed, and found an egg in the cart, but one day the hen, probably frightened by the children, flew across the fence into the neighbor's yard and laid its egg there. The woman heard the cackling, but said to herself, I have no time now, I must tidy up for Sunday. I'll fetch the egg later on. In the evening she went to the cart, but found no egg there. She went and asked her mother-in-law and brother-in-law whether they had taken the egg. No, they had not, but her youngest brother-in-law, Taras, said, your biddy laid its egg in the neighbor's yard. It was there she was cackling, and she flew back across the fence from there. The woman went and looked at the hen. There she was on the perch with the other birds, her eyes just closing ready to go to sleep. The woman wished she could have asked the hen and got an answer from her. Then she went to the neighbors, and Gabriel's mother came out to meet her. What do you want, young woman? Why, Granny, you see, my hen flew across this morning. Did she not lay an egg here? We never saw anything of it. The Lord be thanked, our own hens started laying long ago. We collect our own eggs and have no need of other people's. And we don't go looking for eggs in other people's yards, lass. The young woman was offended, and said more than she should have done. Her neighbor answered back with interest, and the women began abusing each other. Ivan's wife, who had been to fetch water, happening to pass just then, joined in too. Gabriel's wife rushed out, and began reproaching the young woman with things that had really happened and with other things that never had happened at all. Then a general uproar commenced, all shouting at once, trying to get out 2 words at a time, and not choice words either. You're this. And you're that. You're a thief, and you're a slut, and you're starving your old father-in-law to death, and you're a good-for-nothing, and so on, and you've made a hole in the sieve I lent you, you jade. And it's our yoke you're carrying your pails on, you just give back our yoke. Then they caught hold of the yoke, and spilt the water, snatched off one another's shawls, and began fighting. Gabriel, returning from the fields, stopped to take his wife's part. Out rushed Ivan and his son and joined in with the rest. Ivan was a strong fellow, he scattered the whole lot of them, and pulled a handful of hair out of Gabriel's beard. People came to see what was the matter, and the fighters were separated with difficulty. That was how it all began. Gabriel wrapped the hair torn from his beard in a paper, and went to the district court to have the law of Ivan. I didn't grow my beard, said he, for pockmarked Ivan to pull it out. And his wife went bragging to the neighbors, saying they'd have Ivan condemned and sent to Siberia. And so the feud grew. The old man, from where he lay on the top of the oven, tried from the very first to persuade them to make peace, but they would not listen. He told them, it's a stupid thing you are after, children, picking quarrels about such a paltry matter. Just think. The whole thing began about an egg. The children may have taken it, well, what matter? What's the value of one egg? God sends enough for all. And suppose your neighbor did say an unkind word, put it right, show her how to say a better one. If there has been a fight, well, such things will happen, we're all sinners, but make it up, and let there be an end of it. If you nurse your anger it will be worse for you yourselves. But the younger folk would not listen to the old man. They thought his words were mere senseless dotage. Ivan would not humble himself before his neighbor. I never pulled his beard, he said, he pulled the hair out himself. But his son has burst all the fastenings on my shirt, and torn it. Look at it. And Ivan also went to law. They were tried by the justice of the peace and by the district court. While all this was going on, the coupling pin of Gabriel's cart disappeared. Gabriel's womenfolk accused Ivan's son of having taken it. They said, we saw him in the night go past our window, towards the cart, and a neighbor says he saw him at the pub, offering the pin to the landlord, so they went to law about that. And at home not a day passed without a quarrel or even a fight. The children, too, abused one another, having learned to do so from their elders, and when the women happened to meet by the riverside, where they went to rinse the clothes, their arms did not do as much ringing as their tongues did nagging, and every word was a bad one. At first the peasants only slandered one another, but afterwards they began in real earnest to snatch anything that lay handy, and the children followed their example. Life became harder and harder for them. Ivan Cherbakhov and Limping Gabriel kept suing one another at the village assembly, and at the district court, and before the justice of the peace until all the judges were tired of them. Now Gabriel got Ivan fined or imprisoned, then Ivan did as much to Gabriel, and the more they spite each other the angrier they grew, like dogs that attack one another and get more and more furious the longer they fight. You strike one dog from behind, and it thinks it's the other dog biting him, and gets still fiercer. So these peasants, they went to law, and one or other of them was fined or locked up, but that only made them more and more angry with each other. Wait a bit, they said, and I'll make you pay for it. And so it went on for 6 years. Only the old man lying on the top of the oven kept telling them again and again, children, what are you doing? Stop all this paying back, keep to your work, and don't bear malice, it will be better for you. The more you bear malice, the worse it will be, but they would not listen to him. In the 7th year, at a wedding, Ivan's daughter-in-law held Gabriel up to shame, accusing him of having been caught horse stealing. Gabriel was tipsy, and unable to contain his anger, gave the woman such a blow that she was laid up for a week. And she was pregnant at the time. Ivan was delighted. He went to the magistrate to lodge a complaint. Now I'll get rid of my neighbor. He won't escape imprisonment or exile to Siberia. But Ivan's wish was not fulfilled. The magistrate dismissed the case. The woman was examined, but she was up and about and showed no sign of any injury. Then Ivan went to the justice of the peace, but he referred the business to the district court. Ivan bestirred himself, treated the clerk and the elder of the district court to a gallon of liquor and got Gabriel condemned to be flogged. The sentence was read out to Gabriel by the clerk. The court decrees that the peasant Gabriel Gordiev shall receive 20 lashes with a birch rod at the district court. Ivan too heard the sentence read, and looked at Gabriel to see how he would take it. Gabriel grew as pale as a sheet, and turned round and went out into the passage. Ivan followed him, meaning to see to the horse, and he overheard Gabriel say, "Very well. He will have my back flogged, that will make it burn, but something of his may burn worse than that." Hearing these words, Ivan at once went back into the court, and said, "Upright judges. He threatens to set my house on fire." "Listen," he said it in the presence of witnesses. Gabriel was recalled. "Is it true that you said this?" "I haven't said anything." "Flog me, since you have the power. It seems that I alone am to suffer, and all for being in the right, while he is allowed to do as he likes." Gabriel wished to say something more, but his lips and his cheeks quivered, and he turned towards the wall. Even the officials were frightened by his looks. He may do some mischief to himself or to his neighbor, thought they. Then the old judge said, "Look here, my men, you'd better be reasonable and make it up. Was it right of you, friend Gabriel, to strike a pregnant woman? It was lucky it passed off so well, but think what might have happened. Was it right? You had better confess and beg his pardon, and he will forgive you, and we will alter the sentence." The clerk heard these words, and remarked, "That's impossible under Statute 117. An agreement between the parties not having been arrived at, a decision of the court has been pronounced and must be executed." But the judge would not listen to the clerk. "Keep your tongue still, my friend," said he. "The first of all laws is to obey God, who loves peace." And the judge began again to persuade the peasants, but could not succeed. Gabriel would not listen to him. "I shall be 50 next year," said he, "and have a married son, and have never been flogged in my life, and now that pockmarked Ivan has had me condemned to be flogged, and am I to go and ask his forgiveness? No, I've borne enough. Ivan shall have cause to remember me." Again Gabriel's voice quivered, and he could say no more, but turned round and went out. It was 7 miles from the court to the village, and it was getting late when Ivan reached home. He unharnessed his horse, put it up for the night, and entered the cottage. No one was there. The women had already gone to drive the cattle in, and the young fellows were not yet back from the fields. Ivan went in, and sat down, thinking. He remembered how Gabriel had listened to the sentence, and how pale he had become, and how he had turned to the wall, and Ivan's heart grew heavy. He thought how he himself would feel if he were sentenced, and he pitied Gabriel. Then he heard his old father up on the oven cough, and saw him sit up, lower his legs, and scramble down. The old man dragged himself slowly to a seat, and sat down. He was quite tired out with the exertion, and coughed a long time till he had cleared his throat. Then, leaning against the table, he said, "Well, has he been condemned?" "Yes, to 20 strokes with the rods," answered Ivan. The old man shook his head. "A bad business," said he. "You are doing wrong, Ivan." "Ah. It's very bad, not for him so much as for yourself." "Well, they'll flog him, but will that do you any good?" "He'll not do it again," said Ivan. "What is it he'll not do again? What has he done worse than you?" "Why, think of the harm he has done me," said Ivan. "He nearly killed my wife, and now he's threatening to burn us up. Am I to thank him for it?" The old man sighed, and said, "You go about the wide world, Ivan, while I am lying on the oven all these years, so you think you see everything, and that I see nothing. Ah, lad, it's you that don't see, malice blinds you. Other sins are before your eyes, but your own are behind your back. He's acted badly." What a thing to say. If he were the only one to act badly, how could strife exist? Is strife among men ever bred by one alone? Strife is always between two. His badness you see, but your own you don't. If he were bad, but you were good, there would be no strife. Who pulled the hair out of his beard? Who spoilt his haystack? Who dragged him to the law court? Yet you put it all on him. You live a bad life yourself, that's what is wrong. It's not the way I used to live, lad, and it's not the way I taught you. Is that the way his old father and I used to live? How did we live? Why, as neighbors should. If he happened to run out of flour, one of the women would come across. "Uncle Troll, we want some flour. Go to the barn, dear," I'd say, "take what you need." If he'd no one to take his horses to pasture, "Go, Ivan," I'd say, "and look after his horses." And if I was short of anything, I'd go to him. "Uncle Gordie," I'd say, "I want so and so. Take it, Uncle Troll." That's how it was between us, and we had an easy time of it. But now? That soldier the other day was telling us about the fight at Plevna. Why, there's war between you worse than at Plevna. Is that living? What a sin it is. You are a man and master of the house, it's you who will have to answer. What are you teaching the women and the children? To snarl and snap? Why, the other day your Taraska, that greenhorn, was swearing at neighbor Irina, calling her names. And his mother listened and laughed. Is that right? It is. You will have to answer. Think of your soul. Is this all as it should be? You throw a word at me, and I give you two in return. You give me a blow, and I give you two. No, lad. Christ, when he walked on earth, taught us fools something very different. If you get a hard word from anyone, keep silent, and his own conscience will accuse him. That is what our Lord taught. If you get a slap, turn the other cheek. Here, beat me, if that's what I deserve. And his own conscience will rebuke him. He will soften, and will listen to you. That's the way he taught us, not to be proud. Why don't you speak? Isn't it as I say? Ivan sat silent and listened. The old man coughed, and having with difficulty cleared his throat, began again. You think Christ taught us wrong? Why, it's all for our own good. Just think of your earthly life. Are you better off, or worse, since this plevna began among you? Just reckon up what you've spent on all this law business, what the driving backwards and forwards in your food on the way have cost you. What fine fellows your sons have grown. You might live and get on well, but now your means are lessening. And why? All because of this folly, because of your pride. You ought to be plowing with your lads, and do the sowing yourself, but the fiend carries you off to the judge, or to some pettifogger or other. The plowing is not done in time, nor the sowing, and Mother Earth can't bear properly. Why did the oats fail this year? When did you sow them? When you came back from town. And what did you gain? A burden for your own shoulders. Lad, think of your own business. Work with your boys in the field and at home, and if someone offends you, forgive him, as God wished you to. Then life will be easy, and your heart will always be light. Ivan remained silent. Ivan, my boy, hear your old father. Go and harness the roan, and go at once to the government office. Put an end to all this affair there, and in the morning go and make it up with Gabriel in God's name, and invite him to your house for tomorrow's holiday. It was the eve of the Virgin's nativity. Have tea ready, and get a bottle of vodka and put an end to this wicked business, so that there should not be any more of it in future, and tell the women and children to do the same. Ivan sighed, and thought, what he says is true, and his heart grew lighter. Only he did not know how, now, to begin to put matters right, but again the old man began, as if he had guessed what was in Ivan's mind. Go, Ivan, don't put it off. Put out the fire before it spreads, or it will be too late. The old man was going to say more, but before he could do so the women came in, chattering like magpies. The news that Gabriel was sentenced to be flogged, and of his threat to set fire to the house, had already reached them. They had heard all about it and added to it something of their own, and had again had a row, in the pasture, with the women of Gabriel's household. They began telling how Gabriel's daughter-in-law threatened a fresh action. Gabriel had got the right side of the examining magistrate, who would now turn the whole affair upside down. And the schoolmaster was writing out another petition, to the Tsar himself this time, about Ivan, and everything was in the petition, all about the coupling pin and the kitchen garden, so that half of Ivan's homestead would be theirs soon. Ivan heard what they were saying, and his heart grew cold again, and he gave up the thought of making peace with Gabriel. In a farmstead there is always plenty for the master to do. Ivan did not stop to talk to the women, but went out to the threshing floor and to the barn. By the time he had tidied up there, the sun had set and the young fellows had returned from the field. They had been plowing the field for the winter crops with 2 horses. Ivan met them, questioned them about their work, helped to put everything in its place, set a torn horse collar aside to be mended, and was going to put away some stakes under the barn, but it had grown quite dusk, so he decided to leave them where they were till next day. Then he gave the cattle their food, opened the gate, let out the horses. Taras was to take to pasture for the night, and again closed the gate and barred it. Now, thought he, I'll have my supper, and then to bed. He took the horse collar and entered the hut. By this time he had forgotten about Gabriel and about what his old father had been saying to him. But, just as he took hold of the door handle to enter the passage, he heard his neighbor on the other side of the fence cursing somebody in a hoarse voice. What the devil is he good for? Gabriel was saying. He's only fit to be killed. At these words all Ivan's former bitterness towards his neighbor reawoke. He stood listening while Gabriel scolded, and, when he stopped, Ivan went into the hut. There was a light inside. His daughter-in-law sat spinning, his wife was getting supper ready, his eldest son was making straps for Bark's shoes, his second sat near the table with a book, and Taras was getting ready to go out to pasture the horses for the night. Everything in the hut would have been pleasant and bright, but for that plague, a bad neighbor. Ivan entered, sullen and cross, threw the cat down from the bench, and scolded the women for putting the slop pail in the wrong place. He felt despondent, and sat down, frowning, to mend the horse collar. Gabriel's words kept ringing in his ears, his threat at the law court, and what he had just been shouting in a hoarse voice about someone who was only fit to be killed. His wife gave Taras his supper, and, having eaten it, Taras put on an old sheepskin and another coat, tied a sash round his waist, took some bread with him, and went out to the horses. His eldest brother was going to see him off, but Ivan himself rose instead, and went out into the porch. It had grown quite dark outside, clouds had gathered, and the wind had risen. Ivan went down the steps, helped his boy to mount, started the foal after him, and stood listening while Taras rode down the village and was there joined by other lads with their horses. Ivan waited until they were all out of hearing. As he stood there by the gate he could not get Gabriel's words out of his head. "Mind that something of yours does not burn worse." He is desperate, thought Ivan. Everything is dry, and it's windy weather besides. He'll come up at the back somewhere, set fire to something, and be off. He'll burn the place and escape scot-free, the villain. There now, if one could but catch him in the act, he'd not get off then. And the thought fixed itself so firmly in his mind that he did not go up the steps but went out into the street and round the corner. "I'll just walk round the buildings, who can tell what he's after?" And Ivan, stepping softly, passed out of the gate. As soon as he reached the corner, he looked round along the fence, and seemed to see something suddenly move at the opposite corner, as if someone had come out and disappeared again. Ivan stopped, and stood quietly, listening and looking. Everything was still, only the leaves of the willows fluttered in the wind, and the straws of the thatch rustled. At first it seemed pitch dark, but, when his eyes had grown used to the darkness, he could see the far corner, and a plough that lay there, and the eaves. He looked a while, but saw no one. "I suppose it was a mistake," thought Ivan, "but still I will go round," and Ivan went stealthily along by the shed. Ivan stepped so softly in his bark shoes that he did not hear his own footsteps. As he reached the far corner, something seemed to flare up for a moment near the plough and to vanish again. Ivan felt as if struck to the heart, and he stopped. Hardly had he stopped, when something flared up more brightly in the same place, and he clearly saw a man with a cap on his head, crouching down, with his back towards him, lighting a bunch of straw he held in his hand. Ivan's heart fluttered within him like a bird. Straining every nerve, he approached with great strides, hardly feeling his legs under him. "Ah," thought Ivan, "now he won't escape. I'll catch him in the act." Ivan was still some distance off, when suddenly he saw a bright light, but not in the same place as before, and not a small flame. The thatch had flared up at the eaves, the flames were reaching up to the roof, and, standing beneath it, Gabriel's whole figure was clearly visible, like a hawk swooping down on a lark. Ivan rushed at limping Gabriel. "Now I'll have him, he shan't escape me," thought Ivan. But Gabriel must have heard his steps, and, however he managed it, glancing round, he scuttled away past the barn like a hare. "You shan't escape," shouted Ivan, darting after him. Just as he was going to seize Gabriel, the latter dodged him, but Ivan managed to catch the skirt of Gabriel's coat. It tore right off, and Ivan fell down. He recovered his feet, and shouting, "Help! Seize him! Thieves! Murder!" ran on again. But meanwhile Gabriel had reached his own gate. There Ivan overtook him and was about to seize him, when something struck Ivan a stunning blow, as though a stone had hit his temple, quite deafening him. It was Gabriel who, seizing an oak wedge that lay near the gate, had struck out with all his might. Ivan was stunned, sparks flew before his eyes, then all grew dark and he staggered. When he came to his senses Gabriel was no longer there, it was as light as day, and from the side where his homestead was something roared and crackled like an engine at work. Ivan turned round and saw that his back shed was all ablaze, and the side shed had also caught fire, and flames and smoke and bits of burning straw mixed with the smoke were being driven towards his hut. "What is this, friends?" cried Ivan, lifting his arms and striking his thighs. "Why, all I had to do was just to snatch it out from under the eaves and trample on it. What is this, friends?" he kept repeating. He wished to shout, but his breath failed him, his voice was gone. He wanted to run, but his legs would not obey him, and got in each other's way. He moved slowly, but again staggered and again his breath failed. He stood still till he had regained breath, and then went on. Before he had got round the back shed to reach the fire, the side shed was also all ablaze, and the corner of the hut and the covered gateway had caught fire as well. The flames were leaping out of the hut, and it was impossible to get into the yard. A large crowd had collected, but nothing could be done. The neighbors were carrying their belongings out of their own houses, and driving the cattle out of their own sheds. After Ivan's house, Gabriel's also caught fire. Then, the wind rising, the flames spread to the other side of the street and half the village was burnt down. At Ivan's house they barely managed to save his old father. And the family escaped, and what they had on, everything else, except the horses that had been driven out to pasture for the night, was lost. All the cattle, the fowls on their perches, the carts, plows, and harrows, the women's trunks with their clothes, and the grain in the granaries, all were burnt up. At Gabriel's, the cattle were driven out, and a few things saved from his house. The fire lasted all night. Ivan stood in front of his homestead and kept repeating, "What is this? Friends? One need only have pulled it out and trampled on it. But when the roof fell in, Ivan rushed into the burning place, and seizing a charred beam, tried to drag it out. The women saw him, and called him back. But he pulled out the beam, and was going in again for another when he lost his footing and fell among the flames. Then his son made his way in after him and dragged him out. Ivan had singed his hair and beard and burnt his clothes and scorched his hands, but he felt nothing. His grief has stupefied him, said the people. The fire was burning itself out, but Ivan still stood repeating, "Friends. What is this? One need only have pulled it out." In the morning the village elder's son came to fetch Ivan. "Daddy Ivan, your father is dying. He has sent for you to say goodbye." Ivan had forgotten about his father, and did not understand what was being said to him. "What father?" he said. "Whom has he sent for?" "He sent for you, to say goodbye. He is dying in our cottage." "Come along, Daddy Ivan," said the elder's son, pulling him by the arm, and Ivan followed the lad. When he was being carried out of the hut, some burning straw had fallen onto the old man and burnt him, and he had been taken to the village elders in the farther part of the village, which the fire did not reach. When Ivan came to his father, there was only the elder's wife in the hut, besides some little children on the top of the oven. All the rest were still at the fire. The old man, who was lying on a bench holding a wax candle in his hand, kept turning his eyes towards the door. When his son entered, he moved a little. The old woman went up to him and told him that his son had come. He asked to have him brought nearer. Ivan came closer. "What did I tell you, Ivan?" began the old man. "Who has burnt down the village?" "It was he, father." Ivan answered. "I caught him in the act. I saw him shove the firebrand into the thatch. I might have pulled away the burning straw and stamped it out, and then nothing would have happened." "Ivan," said the old man, "I am dying, and you in your turn will have to face death. Whose is the sin?" Ivan gazed at his father in silence, unable to utter a word. "Now, before God, say whose is the sin? What did I tell you?" Only then Ivan came to his senses and understood it all. He sniffed and said, "Mine, father." And he fell on his knees before his father, saying, "Forgive me, father, I am guilty before you and before God." The old man moved his hands, changed the candle from his right hand to his left, and tried to lift his right hand to his forehead to cross himself, but could not do it, and stopped. "Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord," said he, and again he turned his eyes towards his son. "Ivan. I say, Ivan." "What, father? What must you do now?" Ivan was weeping. "I don't know how we are to live now, father," he said. The old man closed his eyes, moved his lips as if to gather strength, and opening his eyes again, said, "You'll manage. If you obey God's will, you'll manage." He paused, then smiled, and said, "Mind, Ivan. Don't tell who started the fire. Hide another man's sin, and God will forgive two of yours." And the old man took the candle in both hands and, folding them on his breast, sighed, stretched out, and died. Ivan did not say anything against Gabriel, and no one knew what had caused the fire, and Ivan's anger against Gabriel passed away, and Gabriel wondered that Ivan did not tell anybody. At first Gabriel felt afraid, but after a while he got used to it. The men left off quarreling, and then their families left off also. While rebuilding their huts, both families lived in one house, and when the village was rebuilt and they might have moved farther apart, Ivan and Gabriel built next to each other, and remained neighbors as before. They lived as good neighbors should. Ivan Shcherbakov remembered his old father's command to obey God's law, and quench a fire at the first spark, and if anyone does him an injury he now tries not to revenge himself, but rather to set matters right again, and if anyone gives him a bad word, instead of giving a worse in return, he tries to teach the other not to use evil words, and so he teaches his womenfolk and children. And Ivan Shcherbakov has got on his feet again, and now lives better even than he did before.